in some form has worked out quite well for Chinese societies, including in Taiwan. So the reason I spoke in Chinese was that it goes to that sort of what I was mentioning about this sort of shocking lack of diversity in voices. It's like what Dr. Li Wenliang said after his incredible contribution to all of us in raising the alarm about that virus before he succumbed to the virus in Wuhan. He said it's a healthy society should have more than one voice. It should have more than one voice. And so this is a bit of an effort just to have a conversation with friends in China. It's sometimes difficult to cut through the noise from whether it's propaganda from the wholly state-owned media in China, or the carefully curated social media ecosystem in China, which is that ecosystem is shockingly lacking in diversity when it comes to these sorts of issues that the intellectuals were wrestling with 100 years ago. It's enormously diverse on a zillion other things. I mean, but not on these questions about politics, about modernizing culture, about history. And so this is an effort to reach out in the Chinese language and open up a conversation with friends in China and around the world.
Shirley, you're on mute.
That's right. Thank you very much, Matt. Now we're on to the exciting part of the program. We have lots of excellent questions from many people who actually know you already, Matt, but we're going to be fair and pick the best questions. So on to Harry.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thanks very much. Our first question comes from a viewer named Mo Roping. And he noted that you described both the Brexit movement and the election of Donald Trump, as well as the May 4th movement, as being populist. And so what he asks is, how do you relate Trump's election to the White House to the spirit of the May 4th movement?
It's a great question. When we were rather hastily piecing together this speech over the weekend, and I was working with a couple of friends to translate what I wrote in English first into Chinese so that I could deliver it in Chinese. I wrestled a lot with the Chinese term for populism, because the term for populism in Chinese, it's usually translated as 民粹主义, and there is a pejorative ring to that term. And so I took a friend's advice to use a different term, and it was 平民主义, which 平民 is like citizens or civilians. So it's the idea again of citizenship being at the heart of the enterprise, at the heart of the politics, and so I think that whether it's China or the United States or the UK or Brazil or really any part of the world, there is a fundamental question about government that is citizen-centric and government that is regime-centric, and that it's a perennial old issue, and it's one that was really what May 4th movement intellectuals were grappling with. And so I think that there are currents, there are a lot of forms of populism. What I'm talking about, and I think what the wave that brought President Trump into office is what I would call a democratic populism. It was a effort, more than an effort, it was an expression of frustration on the parts of the American people that a powerful elite was growing too remote and too self-interested in the views of so many people. And I think that was actually a decisive factor in that election, just as it was in the Brexit vote. And so I thought that was a terrific question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And we'll go on to the next question now, who comes from Will Malden. And he thanks you for the presentation. And he says, with some in the administration calling for the US to take measures against China for allowing or covering up the coronavirus outbreak, does Washington have any economic options it could use without blowing up the 3-month-old phase 1 trade agreement?
Yeah, so look, the best authority on this is President Trump himself, who talked about this actually just yesterday in a town hall meeting. So the U.S. isn't looking at punitive measures here. What President Trump is looking at doing is continuing with the policy that he ran on, the policy that he's implemented, which is to have a reciprocal and fair relationship with China, not one in which the U.S. Allows ourselves to be taken advantage of in the hope that somehow China will just automatically liberalize. That has not happened. In fact, in many respects, Chinese friends of mine believe that China is moving in a much more illiberal direction in recent years, following the entry into the WTO in 2001. Some have argued that China coming to the WTO did not hasten or accelerate a move towards liberalism, but actually removed the impetus for further reforms in the market realm, as well as certainly in the political realm, because the entry into the WTO allowed China's system to become much wealthier through its access to capital and access to overseas markets in Europe and the United States and so on. I'd refer you to President Trump's remarks yesterday. We have a deal, an initial phase 1 trade deal that was signed at the beginning of this year. President Trump has every expectation and desire to see China fulfill its end of the bargain, and he's made clear that he's not going to remove tariffs. The tariffs are what allowed us gave us the leverage to actually achieve that deal in the first place. And he's going to be watching very carefully to make sure that China holds up its end of the bargain.
Thank you. Next one comes from Professor Rana Mitter. Congratulations on your fluent and thoughtful speech. My question is, the May 4th spirit included genuine cosmopolitanism and learning from each other's cultures, and China learned much from the West during May 4th. What can we in the West learn from China's May 4th experience?
So, that's a great question, and I think Professor Mitter would give a much better answer than I can, given how well steeped he is in this history. I mentioned in my remarks the example of Zhang Pengchun, PC Chang, who I think I used his example because he was someone who did come to the United States on one of those indemnity scholarships, just like Hu Shi. He studied under the great Dewey, John Dewey, who was a very influential educator and philosopher at Columbia University. He learned a lot about theater and brought some of that back to China. But the really interesting thing about PC Chang is that he then came back to the West with a head full of ideas about how China should influence the world, how it should influence conversations about philosophy. And most decisively, his biggest contribution was his role in drafting the Declaration on Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt, she chaired that panel, and that was adopted in the late 40s as the seminal document designed to try to prevent humanity from descending into the horrors of the first half of the 20th century ever again. And so PC Chang brought to the table a very Chinese perspective. He said that human rights is not exclusively the domain of Western Christianity. It is not the domain of ancient Western philosophy. There are currents, very strong currents of human rights in Confucianism and in the long 2 millennia following Confucius. And so he had a decisive effect in really putting the word universal into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So I think that's one potent example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, the next question comes from someone who I think you know, Jaime Florcruz, also a journalist. And he says, aside from invoking or inviting Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science to come to China, the other legacy of the May 4th movement was the popular goal or even obsession of Zhengxing Zhonghua to rejuvenate China and to oppose foreign bullying. Do you agree with that? And how does that affect American policy toward China today? How do you coexist with the people and a political power who wish to make their nation great again and that resents being told that they should should do bullying?
What they should do to fight off bullying.
Right, what they should do to fight off bullying.
Yeah, great. It's great to know that Jaime Florcruz is on the line, and thanks for the question. It's been a long time. It'd be great to see you sometime. The rejuvenation of China absolutely was one of the core themes as well of the May 4th movement. And of course, it's called the May 4th movement because students were so outraged by China's shoddy treatment by all the powers in Japan at the Treaty of Versailles talks that they took to the streets. China's felt like it was being carved up. China didn't fight as a combatant in World War I, but it did provide a lot of labor into Europe on the side of the Allies, and it got a really raw deal. The Versailles Treaty was a raw deal for a lot of people in a lot of countries. China got a really raw deal on that, which is why people took to the streets. And when they weren't allowed to continue the demonstration, some of the students went and actually burned down a few houses of Chinese officials. One of the Chinese officials whose house got burnt down was an official who had accepted a very predatory loan by the Japanese government to China that they thought would surrender, in essence, Chinese sovereignty to the Japanese through debt diplomacy. And so they burnt down that official's house. So rejuvenating China, I don't know anyone who has ever who spent significant time in China who did not, especially in the years leading up to the turn of the century. I was lucky to work as a journalist in the late 90s in China because it was a hopeful moment. There was a lot of reform going on of the economy. There was the beginning of the internet in the early days in China. The internet was a little bit more wild and free, and you did hear more of that plurality of voices that Li Wenliang so sorely missed, as he commented on his deathbed. No foreigner that I knew in that time wasn't rooting for China to rejuvenate. People were rooting for China's success. We were rooting for the success of the Chinese people, and we took enormous pleasure in the creativity, entrepreneurial spirit, and drive of the Chinese people over the course of the reform and opening period before that period ended just a handful of years ago. I think that it's hard to argue that reform and opening still exists as we interpret it at that point. But in terms of bullying and so forth, there's a danger. I talked at the end of my remarks, the Chinese portion, about balancing nationalism and this instinct to be great again with responsive, accountable government. If you do introduce democratic norms and you do have a more accountable government, it actually makes the odds of greatness for the country even greater.
Thank you, Matt. We're quickly running out of time, but if we could extend your time for one more question. This is from Ted Pulling. Matt, you lived in Hong Kong and know the city well. How do you see events playing out in that city? And maybe you could reference the impending legislative election, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Is it worth Washington's time to get involved in Hong Kong, or is it an internal matter for Beijing?
Yeah, look, the Sino-British joint declaration, which allowed for the return of Hong Kong to China, is a document that is clearly binding. It's a binding document. It was a document that was recognized by governments around the world as such. It was a document that was registered as a treaty at the United Nations. The US is watching with real concern the erosion of the promises that were made on the Chinese side of that agreement. And frankly, I mentioned in my Chinese remarks the example of the millions of people in Hong Kong who took to the streets peacefully last year, peacefully. Millions of people. We're talking about a massive percentage. It was of Hong Kongers got on their feet and went out into the streets to advocate for their rights under the basic law, what was promised to them as part of that Sino-British joint declaration, and really, in essence, in support of maintaining the rule of law. And the rule of law is sometimes mistranslated. In fact, it's uniformly mistranslated by the Chinese government as 依法治国, which is a little sleight of hand that means using the law to run a country rather than the law being supreme to the men and women who have the privilege of serving in government. And so 法治 in the true sense is as I defined it in the speech.
Thanks. Here's a question from Drew Thompson. Matt, you mentioned Taiwan in your speech. Can you elaborate on how Taiwan's democratic system shapes US policy towards the island? With 23 million people, is Taiwan, in your opinion, a viable model for a much larger China?
Yeah, Drew, thanks for the question. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, PC Chang resigned his job as an official. You know, he was a storied diplomat. He'd been China's ambassador to several countries and several different different civilizations, different parts of the world. And in the end, after his work on the Universal Declaration, he resigned because he was frustrated with the lack of progress towards democracy. And I can't speak to how he would view it today, but I think that Taiwan has been a pretty astonishing example of, you know, shows sort of the bankruptcy of the claim that China's not ready or Chinese people aren't suited to democracy and so forth. That's not to say that that's what we're foisting on anybody. As I mentioned in the speech, how China governs itself is going to be up to the Chinese people. It's not for anyone else to decide. The May 4th movement belongs to the Chinese people. There's a lot that we've learned from it, but it belongs to them. And the speech today was really just an attempt to remind a current generation of friends in the United States and in China and elsewhere of the legacy of that movement.
Well, thanks very much, Pat. I wish we had more time. We have lots more questions. But having heard your keynote speech, we now have a second keynote conversation with James Steinberg that will be introduced and moderated by Bill Antholis. Over to you, Bill.
Well, Shirley, Harry, and Matt, thank you so much. We're now thrilled to turn to the Honorable James Steinberg here with us. Jim has been a major force in crafting U.S. foreign policy for over 30 years. Among other governmental and research positions, Jim was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, the same position that Matt holds now, and then Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration for Secretary Hillary Clinton. Like Harry, he's twice been a dean at the LBJ School and the Maxwell School, and was vice president and head of research at Brookings, as well as a research analyst at RAND. Full disclosure, I've worked for Jim twice in government, and he helped bring me to Brookings. But since I no longer work for him, I can say without conflict of interest that he is widely regarded, including by me, as the leading foreign policy thinker of our time. Among other things, Jim has played a critical role in designing the architecture of China policy under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and then helping implement it. He helped manage a period that saw rapid integration between the US and China, a process that was in many ways mutually beneficial, but which also has generated its share of tensions. As Matt mentioned, particularly in the 90s, there were enormous periods of great optimism. But now we're in a particularly rough patch. So we're delighted to have Jim walk us through the challenges of cooperating with a rival. Jim, we know we'll get you back to Charlottesville soon, but for the meantime, thanks for zooming in from Cazenovia outside of Syracuse.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. I wish I could replicate Matt's impressive speech in Mandarin, but I can simply say ni hao to our Chinese friends, and thank you for having me.
So let's start with the big picture, Jim. After 25 years of trying to cooperate with China, we're now arguably at a low point in the relationship. So what went wrong? Were we too optimistic, as Matt pointed out, about optimism about what cooperation with China might achieve?
Well, it's a great question, Bill. And I think you're right in characterizing it as a low point. I think it's important as we think about this particular low point to recall some of the other low points that we experienced in the history of US-China relations. Matt touched on a few going back to the Versailles Peace Conference, but also to recall how low the times were when China entered the Korean War and threatened our troops, when it shelled the islands off its coast and towards Taiwan in the 1950s. And for me, particularly because it's the time that I became personally involved directly in US-China relations, was in the aftermath of Tiananmen and the difficulties of that time as well. So we've experienced a lot of difficulties. We've overcome them in the past. That doesn't guarantee the past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And I do think we face a unique set of challenges now. You asked a really important question, what went wrong? I gave a speech last year about that, wrote an article in the Texas National Security Review for those interested, looking at the history of all of this and trying to understand both what our expectations were, particularly from my time in the Clinton administration, and then what's been responsible for the difficulties that we've had since then. I think the first thing to say is that, and this question about whether we were overly optimistic, I think as you go back and revisit the thinking of the time and how we saw this during the 90s, I think Matt Pottinger had it exactly right, which is that we believed that on the whole, there was a better chance that there would be good relations between the United States and China if China were a successful, prosperous country rather than a struggling, difficult one that felt surrounded and under pressure. And I think that a case can be made that remains true today, that would we have been better off if we had tried to continue the kind of containment policy or pressure that had characterized US-China relations in the 1950s and 1960s. And I think it's a hard case to make. So we certainly believed, and I think a case can be made that a prosperous China had a better chance of being a country that was respectful of the rights of both its own people and the rest of the world than one that was struggling. But we also never made our policy bet based on an assumption that that would come about. We thought it was important to give that opportunity a try, but also to recognize that the relationship was always going to be governed by what China did. And that, I think, has been a watchword of the policy through many administrations, through the Clinton administration, through President George W. Bush administrations, is that we had to create the possibility of cooperation without assuming that it was going to happen, to create an opportunity for reform to take place without assuming that anything that we did necessarily would guarantee that that would happen. And I think what we've heard today and what everybody has been able to observe is correct, which is that certainly our hopes for some of the changes we would have liked to have seen have not been realized. And I think that's an important part of what we have to address now and to try to understand why that might be the case. I think the single most important factor has been the difficulties that China has faced in trying to move from a country which was largely a relatively poor and relatively weak country to one which is now much more successful and much more capable. The relationship was built beginning in the Nixon years on a great asymmetry between the United States and China, both in military power and in economic clout. And that made the managing the relationship not easy, but it certainly was less challenging because China ultimately, as was seen from the Nixon years, was not going to be in any sense even capable of posing a serious threat to the United States. As China's been successful and that's brought so many benefits, it's been clear that the relationship needed to change. And I think to the extent that things have gone wrong, to use your words and the words that I used, it's by the failure of both of us to find a new basis for the relationship with a much stronger and much more capable China. Now, I say both of us, but I also have argued, and we'll be happy to elaborate today on the fact that there's a special responsibility for China in this case, as the rising power, as the country which potentially poses a threat to what was a very stable and prosperous East Asia and world. China has a special responsibility to show that it will use its increased capacity, its increased capability, not just for its own benefit and not to harm the interest of others. It's the great Peter Parker principle that with great power comes great responsibility. And I don't think that China has met that test.
Let's talk about one area in particular, Jim, that I know you followed closely, which is security relations. You know, China defense spending has increased 15% on average year over year since 2007. It now has the second largest defense budget in the world. They've exported arms to a number of different states. So, you know, in that context, how do we react? How do we show China the right way to act? And if they don't respond, is it still incumbent on us to cooperate?
You know, Bill, I mean, we can look at the absolute numbers of China's military spending. It has increased quite a bit. It's still significantly smaller than the amount that we spend. You know, I think Matt's reference to May 4th, and especially that very good discussion towards the end about that aspect of the May 4th movement, which was the determination of the Chinese people and the leaders of that movement not to be coerced by the rest of the world, explains why China, like any country, is going to do the things it needs to provide for its own security. So we shouldn't be surprised that China wants to feel secure. We want to feel secure. Why do we spend money ourselves on defense? We have a legitimate right and interest in doing that. The question is, how do we do it? How do we provide for our own security? How does China provide for its own security in a way that isn't threatening to others? So what bothers me is not the amount of money that China spends on defense or the military, it's how it does it. And to the extent that it's doing it by developing capabilities that are threatening to others and threaten the interests of others, by threatening the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, by making claims against territories and trying to use it, enforce them through coercion, as it's done against the Philippines and others, Vietnam, in the areas of the South China Sea, that's what of concern. China has a responsibility to show that while it's entitled to provide for its own security and to have the military means that are commensurate with its own economic and technological prowess, that it's not trying to do it at the expense of others, that it's not trying to succeed and provide for itself by harming the legitimate interests of others, China to Japan, to the countries of ASEAN, Korea, and others.
Jim, let's talk about COVID in that sense as well. I mean, we've all been looking at and talking about Chinese-U.S. cooperation on a range of global challenges. The cooperation during the Obama administration on climate change was a big breakthrough. And one would have thought, based on cooperation in previous pandemics, that U.S.-Chinese cooperation on this one would have been better. Matt, in his remarks, pointed to the lack of appreciation for dissenting voices in China, particularly to the physicians in Wuhan that pointed to the outbreak and the initial response as a failing. And now it's led to a lot of recrimination back and forth. Should we still cooperate with China on the outbreak of this? Is it still possible? Should we be pushing back on them? Why should or we shouldn't be treating this as, frankly, an act of irresponsibility on the Chinese parts as opposed to something on which we can cooperate together?
You know, I think the initial response by the Chinese leadership was both disturbing and frankly hard to understand. China had gone through the experience with SARS in 2002, 2003. And I think many people felt, and there's been actually some very great, interesting articles written, some postmortems on that experience that showed the inadequacies and the mistakes that were made in the handling of SARS, and the expectation that the Chinese leadership would have learned those lessons in terms of how to deal with these things and the need for openness and transparency in the early going, because that really was part of the reason why SARS initially seemed to get out of hand. And yet we saw, at least to the best I can judge, a lot of replication of the same kinds of behavior in response to COVID as we saw in the SARS crisis. So I think the world is entitled to be concerned about the lack of transparency, about the tendency to try to point fingers rather than to open up and to try to get the kind of help from the international community that was necessary. And there were clearly consequences associated with that. A better response by the Chinese early clearly would have made a difference. How much is hard to know. That having been said, there's plenty of time for the recriminations. Right now, what we need to focus on is how we best work together. Because frankly, even if China gets a hold of the COVID virus within China itself, even if we get a hold of it within the United States, we're all going to be affected by the spread around the world. And I think there's a very deep concern as COVID begins to spread to poorer and less capable countries about the long-term impacts that will have as well. So we'll have time enough to have the conversation. I think it's appropriate to have a serious investigation as to how this came about and what the responses were. But we need to focus right now on what we can do together to manage this, particularly because I think we all know that this is not a one-off thing, that we knew from the experience of the Spanish flu in 1917, 18, 19, that there will be subsequent waves, that we're all going to have to deal with this for an extended period of time and need to deal with both preventive and treatment measures over the coming years.
As you say, it is a big thing and we'll be dealing with it for some time, including the economic dimensions of it. We're all focused on that in the United States, but it's clearly been rocking the Chinese economy as well. And so one question's out there is if you see the relationship, or if one sees the relationship as a conflictual one, is Chinese economic weakness in our interest? Some people interpreted TPP, for instance, as an alliance of Western-oriented economies against China. Talk about that a little bit. Is the relationship, has it become, the economic relationship become inherently conflictual as opposed to cooperative? And do we have a mutual interest in growing our economies again? Or does this mark a real breaking point where we're going to be just flat out competing with the Chinese?
Well, we have a lot of experience from history about this. And one of the things we learned during the Great Depression was that when you're going into a depression, the last thing in the world you want to do is increase protectionism and decrease global demand, right? That precisely at times like this, we need more international cooperation. We need to find ways to stimulate demand, to stimulate economic growth, and that if each country tries to solve the problem unilaterally by closing its borders and trying to solve this problem nationally, it can only deepen the crisis. So I think history demonstrates to us why at a time like this, the last thing we want to do is try to beggar thy neighbor and to try to go this alone. We're not going to be able to sustain global growth if all of the major economies of the world are not growing. That means the United States, China, Europe, Japan, and the like. So just as we did in the face of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we We need a global strategy to help stabilize the global economy, which is necessary for each of our national economies to grow. And it needs to remind us that some of the broader protectionist forces that have been troubling us even before the COVID outbreak are really threatening to all of our long-term prosperity. There are obviously issues around trade. We need to make sure that trade is fair and free, that there isn't intellectual property theft, that appropriate protection is given to labor and to the environment. But we still ought to be animated by a sense that we grow most effectively if we grow together as a global economy.
I'm going to ask you a question, Jim, that Doyle McManus of the LA Times had initially posed to Matt, and we weren't able to get it to it, but I think it's relevant to this point, and I'd love to hear your thought. Is the US now in the equivalent of a Cold War with the PRC, a global struggle between competing systems? And is the US doing enough to build and nurture alliances with other democratic natures to prevail against a competitor so skilled at divide and conquer?
Well, it's great to hear from Doyle, and he's been one of the great observers of this over his many years of distinguished journalism. You know, I think that for a long time, there was a reluctance to think about Cold War analogies in thinking about Sino-US relations. But I regret to say that I think there are elements that are coming to bear here, most largely because I think that there is a growing tendency to see this relationship not just as a matter of economic competition, but of ideological competition. And that element of seeing this as ideological competition makes it much more difficult to cooperate. And I think that it tends to build a greater sense that our success depends on the other side's failure. That is, we would be better off, as was some suggested in the earlier discussion, if China didn't succeed, if it were weaker, if it didn't have the capacity to spend money on the military. And even the suggestion that Matt made that we made a mistake in letting China into WTO because it got prosperous and therefore more capable. Those have all the elements of a Cold War competition, and seeing everything in zero-sum terms. I mean, there's no doubt that there are aspects of the relationship which have zero-sum dimensions to it, but we also have tremendous areas of shared interest. And the COVID experience ought to remind us that in problems like this and climate change, as you mentioned, we have to be able to work together. That becomes very difficult in a Cold War framing in which our success is depend on their failure. So I think we are in danger of moving into that paradigm of seeing everything as it's either us or them. And I think we ought to avoid it. But I also, taking the implication of Doyle's question, say, even if we try to avoid the Cold War framework, that still doesn't mean we shouldn't try to strengthen our ties with our countries that share our interests and our values. We certainly are not going to be able to deal with China more effectively by going it alone. We need partners. And the most important reason for doing this is because many of the things that Matt said today in his critique of China and Chinese policy are absolutely right. But they'll be much more effective if they come from a group of countries together articulating this, rather than the United States being sort of seen as the country which is now making the indictment of China, because that builds the sense of Cold War confrontation, of bilateral confrontation. But if you have multiple voices, if you have our friends in Europe, our friends in Japan, our friends in Korea, our friends in Australia, all articulating the same message, it's harder for China to claim that this is just the United States trying to resist China's rise. So we need our friends and allies more than ever. And we need to make sure that we incorporate them into developing our own strategies to deal with the challenge posed by China.
A slightly different take on a similar set of questions, a question from Len Schappa, which was directed at Matt. Len is a senior professor here who's an expert in Japan, among other places, but also follows East Asia quite closely. I couldn't help but notice that Matt opted not to preface his remarks by saying these were his own views. The absence of this precedence and the fact that he was speaking from the White House with flags behind him suggests he is expressing the views of the president. Is the White House calling on China to rise up in populism against the Chinese party? This seems to be a pretty bold and risky diplomatic move, even if I share the sentiments. Is this likely to seriously worsen relations with China? Jim, you've sat in that office. You've had those flags behind you. As you watched that, what was your reaction to what you heard the White House essentially saying to the Chinese people directly?
So, I respect the challenge that the White House faces here, which is it has always been American policy to speak up for the values that we believe in. And one of those values is democracy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with an American official standing up and saying, as Matt did, that we believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We believe that it is not a culturally determined or civilizationally determined set of values, that countries all over the world subscribe to that convention and other related human rights principles, and that they are universal, and that we want for the Chinese people the same thing we want for ourselves and for every place else. And I think that willingness to speak for the universality of human rights and of human dignity is something that characterizes all American administrations. I think the challenge is to do it in a way that's respectful of the fact that different countries have sought to achieve that in different ways. And we need to respect that. We need to respect the achievements that the Chinese have brought over the last 70 years in terms of building a prosperous society that has created great opportunity. And so we need to find a way to be open and unafraid to speak about the values that we believe belong to everyone in a way that recognizes that each country has to find a way to achieve those things. And so the voices that we think for openness, for transparency, for having the multiple voices that Matt talked about are things that have always been spoken from the White House. You'll recall, Bill, when President Clinton stood next to President Jiang Zemin in the Great Hall of the People and said, we have a different view about the course of history and about the way these things go. And we think that some of the choices that China have made are on the wrong side of history. The president made that same similar remark in the White House when he stood with President Jiang Zemin when he came to Washington. So it's been a hallmark of American presidents, Democratic, Republican, to say that this is who we are as a people, and we will speak for this thing. But to understand that we don't do this in a way to try to harm China or to try to damage China, but rather because it's something we fundamentally believe in.
Jim, I want to come back to elements of cooperation and what we might have actually learned from the Chinese. We have a great question from the audience. But to the idea, if one interprets Len Schapa's question, that we might actually be interfering in domestic Chinese politics, what about the reverse? We all know China sought to interfere with the 2016 election. Are you worried about China interfering in 2020 here?
So I think you mean the Russian interference.
Russia interfering. Yeah, I'm sorry, Russia.
I understand. And I mean, first of all, I think we cannot underestimate how much damage the efforts of the Russians in 2016 represents. And this is profoundly unacceptable behavior, right? And we need to be very, very clear that we are prepared to take measures to respond to this. And we're not going to sweep it under the rug or to pretend that it isn't consequential. Countries that engage in that kind of behavior, there ought to be consequences in our relationship with them if they do it. I have no reason to expect that the Chinese would do that, but I don't think we should take it for granted. I think we have to be alert to the possibility that they would do it. It's hard for me to think what would motivate them to do that, but it would be damaging. Again, I don't have a problem with China's leadership speaking out about policies that we pursue that they think are wrong, just as we have no problem speaking out, but there's no place for under the table covert manipulation of media, deep fakes, and the kinds of things that we saw from 2016. So if the Chinese have a view and they want to take out ads in US newspapers to express that view, as long as they do it openly and publicly and allow us to debate, the wisdom of having to do it, that part doesn't bother me. But I do think that we should, again, although I have no reason to think that they would do it, doesn't mean we should be complacent or just assume that. We need to be attentive to the possibility that they would do it. We also, frankly, Bill, need to be attentive to the possibility that people would try to manipulate this. The part of the danger here is that third parties have an interest in trying to stoke the flames, right? And so as we watch this, we want to make sure that we're alert, but also be cognizant of the fact that others may want to try to stimulate a sense of one or the other trying to undermine the other country, and make sure that if we do make accusations, that they're well founded.
So to the spirit of cooperation, Jim, in watching China's reaction internally to the COVID crisis, after their initial stumbles, if you just simply look at the numbers that are available, they largely contained the outbreak to Wuhan and to Hubei province. And they did a reasonably good job of shutting it down. And one can look at other East Asian countries and see similar successes. One can look to some countries in Europe that did quite well, Germany and Greece, and others that did poorly, Italy and the UK. Particularly looking at China, did you see things that we should be not just learning from, but cooperating with them on? And or how should we be thinking about the numbers coming out of China? And do you suspect that things are actually much worse there than they appear to be?
So I don't have any privileged information about what's going on. I'm in touch with colleagues in China. It does appear that the Chinese government was reasonably successful in confining this to Wuhan, and I'm sure it would have been, a major matter of enormous concern, because as bad as it was in Wuhan, imagine that replicated in Guangzhou, in Shanghai, in Tianjin, and elsewhere. But your question really shows, one, that there's nothing particular about the Chinese system or the role of the Communist Party or an authoritarian government in being successful in managing this. We've seen in a range of highly open, transparent, democratic countries enormous success. And great credit is due, as Matt said, to the people in Taiwan and the government in Taiwan, in South Korea, in other countries about how they've done this. And I think that there are important lessons here, and it's why we need international cooperation. It's easy to criticize the WHO for its response. I've actually, in my classes over the years, had my students study how the WHO responded to the Ebola crisis to see whether our international organizations are up to the job in managing these transnational threats. And I think it's indisputably the case that the WHO was not as effective as it should have been. And it also seems clear that there wasn't as much cooperation by China with the WHO as there should have been. But right now, the WHO should be the forum for sharing experiences, for best practices, from what we can learn from each other. I think we look at the fact that other countries have done much better. They're different. They face different challenges from the United States. But we need fora like the WHO to be the place where the experts, the epidemiologists, the people who develop these kinds of social policies can work together to share their experiences, to learn from each other, and to make the international response both now in dealing with this particular disease and in subsequent ones as well, because this isn't the last pandemic we're going to face in the world. And we need the international capability. We need the resources and the expertise on a shared basis for the international community to work effectively together.
There's been a lot of commentary, Jim, not just on how China engaged with the WHO, but how they engaged with other countries, including Western democracies, in assessing the WHO and providing guidance. And then even more generally, broad comments about Chinese diplomacy post-COVID, assistance to other countries, rhetoric to other countries. What are you watching there, and what are you seeing?
So I am disturbed by what we've seen, especially from Chinese diplomacy abroad. I think, as we were talking about earlier, the question has always been, how would China use its growing capability and power? And would it use it in a way that was broadly in the interest of the international community as a whole, the kind of rhetoric that President Xi has used when he went to Davos and talked about his commitment to globalization, or whether China would try to use its clout to try to coerce and intimidate other countries? And we have seen instances in recent weeks where it seems to be the latter. And I think that that's deeply disturbing, and it will lead countries appropriately to draw inferences about how China sees its ability to use this capability and this power that it's accumulated over recent years, and to draw the appropriate lessons. I think the Chinese leadership needs to really look seriously at how countries are reacting, because not only is it causing great negative reactions around the world to Chinese diplomacy, but ultimately it's going to harm China itself if other countries are going to take measures in response to it. So I think we are at a watershed moment, and I think it's a time for reflection by everyone to see how their response to this difficult period of time, does it enhance the long-term interests of their country, or will it have adverse consequences that will just only deepen the divide just between China and the United States, but between China and other countries around the world?
Jim, how are you thinking about the broader science and technology issues? We'll be getting into some of these today. The debates over 5G, the debates over the internet within China and regulation of internet-based companies in the United States that might want to market to China. Do you think COVID will be a setback for a lot of those efforts to try to effectively negotiate and cooperate with China? Or do you think there's an opportunity to have a reset post-COVID?
I hope it's the latter, Bill, because I think that COVID demonstrates why we need to do this. And I think that it's important to try to disaggregate some of the issues here. There's no place for any, theft of commercial property or industrial secrets that are, what power the private sector, which, companies invest in, and they're entitled to protect. And China, in principle, has agreed to protect these things. And we ought to be very clear and tough-minded about making sure that none of that takes place. But there's a different question when it comes to basic scientific research and technology. And there, I think we're beginning to see the same kind of competition infect, or if I could use the words, probably an inappropriate choice here, the relationship in areas where we ought to be cooperating. So in terms of basic scientific research, basic biomedical research, we're now starting to see both sides seeing this as something that one side or the other should benefit, and we need to try to reduce the degree of cooperation that we have by researchers in basic science and physics and biology and chemistry in both of our countries. We need more of that kind of cooperation. We need to understand that when it comes to trying to understand how to deal with the problems of cancer, how to cure viruses like COVID, that we need the best minds in both of our countries and all of our countries to be working together. So we need to create more space for that kind of cooperation while legitimately protecting industrial and commercial secrets and protecting them from inappropriate expropriation.
Jim, John Zemansky has an extended question that we can send to you, but to summarize, he talks about the diversity within China. And this is particularly meaningful for me with respect to you, and that some people in the audience know I wrote a book about the provinces in China steered by you, including steering me to spend time in Chengdu in Sichuan province. As you watched the rise of Xi Jinping, the central control, the return to a more centralized and authoritarian China, and the reaction to COVID in China, and how do you see that playing out? I know it's a little bit hard to see this, but China is enormously diverse, and a moment like this can be a shock to the system. What are you watching for there? What are you able to see right now?
My own experience is like yours, Bill, which is, I've been privileged to be able to spend a fair amount of time in China over the years. I still go back and teach visiting classes in China quite regularly and meet with the students and the faculty there. And, I remain encouraged. I still see people who are similar to you and I and all the people who are listening to this around the world. They're inquiring minds. They want to have different sources of opinion. They'll have different opinions, right? And they won't always agree with us. But I think that genuine open spirit, this inquiry, this desire to know and to hear different voices is universal and is as present in China. And I fundamentally believe that over time that spirit will triumph, that it is impossible for ideological uniformity to be imposed, no matter how draconian the measures, no matter how much technology may be able to implement surveillance or social credit scoring and the like, that basic human spirit that wants to question, to challenge, to know, to ask why, is going to prevail in China just like it prevails every place else. And I would hope that the Chinese leadership would understand that in the long term, it's in the interest of the leadership itself. I know that they're proud of the accomplishments that the Communist Party has brought to China over the past 70 years, and deservedly so. But to the extent that it is proud of those achievements, it ought to be willing to have them debated openly and to make the case to the Chinese people about why the system is more effective and better than others, rather than trying to make sure that those voices aren't heard. I think that in the end of the day, that spirit will triumph. It will triumph around the world. I'm a deep believer in that, and that governments, no matter how capable, ultimately can't suppress that basic feature of human nature.
It's a good transition to a question from Dale Copeland, who's a professor in the politics department here and a Miller Center senior fellow. And he tries to get at the tension in strategy between economic cooperation and conflict and strategic cooperation, national security cooperation. And he suggests that that one strategy would be to continue and maybe even return to economic cooperation while being more hard-headed on the national security cooperation. We've almost seen the inverse of that during the Trump administration, where they've been so hard in competing on the economic side and have been less vocal on the security side. Could you see a return to that, particularly as both economies are trying to come out of probably a recession, maybe a depression, or do you foresee tough competition in both realms?
So it's a great question, but I'm very skeptical, because I believe that if we view each other as truly strategic rivals and potentially enemies, then we have to worry about the other's success, and that we get to a point where any form of technological cooperation potentially could contribute to the military capabilities of the others, and so all technology cooperation becomes suspect. Any economic dependence becomes a potential point of weakness or vulnerability. And so the dynamic that we're seeing now, I think, and this broadening of the tensions between our countries to get into the economic sphere is precisely a product of the fact that we're seeing each other as strategic rivals. So I don't think you can insulate the economic cooperation from this if we see each other as genuine rivals, as opposed to countries in which have differences of interest. I mean, I think we don't have to have an identity of interest. We can have points of disagreement, but if it's a true rivalry, it is almost inherently zero-sum, and I think it's almost impossible to insulate the economic sphere from that.
Mm-hmm. Riga Tenzin asks a question. The term you coined, strategic reassurance, be compared to détente with the Soviet Union in the early years of the Cold War. And just playing that question out, détente was followed by a much more ideologically sharp Reagan administration, in a sense, prefaced a little bit by Carter. And that led in its own way to certain challenges on the US-Russian relationship moving forward. How do you think about that? If we are coming back into, or right now in a period that is starting to look like the Cold War, is strategic reassurance essentially a new form of détente?
I think it's a slightly different approach to a similar question, which is the idea here is to find ways to assess what the long-term intentions of each side are, and to give each side a chance to demonstrate that it wants to pursue its interests in ways that are compatible with the interests of the other side. So if you look at the experience of détente in the mid and late 1970s, one can argue that the Nixon administration, in effect, created space for the Soviet Union to demonstrate what its long-term intentions were, and that the behavior of the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1970s demonstrated, at least to some, that the intentions were not very good, whether it had to do with the missile buildups in the Soviet Union, or the invasion of Afghanistan, or the activities of the Soviet Union in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. The conclusion that was drawn was that the Soviet Union was not respecting the idea of not impinging on the interest of others. And so you can see the Reagan or even the late Carter administration reactions as one is saying, okay, we gave them a chance to show what their intentions are, here's the conclusions that we draw. Now you can argue, and I know you have several good colleagues there, including Mel Leffler, who would say maybe we didn't interpret those actions by the Soviet Union correctly, but it is the same idea, which is to give China the opportunity to demonstrate how it's going to use its power and to draw conclusions accordingly. And I think the concern right now is whether China's recent actions, particularly the kinds that you and I just talked about in terms of this implied elements of coercion that we've been hearing from some of the Chinese diplomats, is China showing its real hand. Because the flip side of strategic reassurance is, as the title of the book says, is strategic resolve, which is that if China is not prepared to provide the kind of reassurance that its neighbors in the United States is entitled to, then we should draw the adverse conclusions from that and be prepared to deal with a much more contentious relationship.
So Jim, we have time for one more question. We started a little late because of Matt's session going late. So I'm gonna end where, in some level, not you and I fully began, but where at least my own work on climate change began. U.S.-China cooperation on climate change was essential during the Obama administration. It led to the breakthrough at Paris. The Trump administration then walked back on the Paris Accord. If one looks forward to a Biden administration, do you expect this to come back? And what is required for that, including for the Chinese to trust the United States? We went back on a global agreement that we pushed them hard to cooperate on. How does one put that Humpty Dumpty back together again?
So it's a challenge. And I think that part of the problem here is not only a question of who's president of the United States, although obviously it's consequential, and I'll pass on expressing an opinion on that. People can probably surmise my view. But we need a broader national consensus, because I think it's very difficult to move forward even if you have a president who wants to move in one particular direction, if there's not a sufficient support in the Congress and in the American public. You'll recall, Bill, very well what happened after the Kyoto Agreement, right? Which was the president believed, despite the flaws and the very evident flaws of the Kyoto Agreement, it was important for us to try to move the process forward by agreeing. But President Clinton did not have the backing of the Congress, and especially of the United States Senate, in taking that forward. And so what we need to do, and the next president, whether it's President Trump or President Biden or whoever, needs to figure out how do we develop a sustainable long-term approach to global cooperation. The direction we're going is not one I think that's good for the United States, but you can't simply have a president come in and say, well, I'm going to do it completely different. I'm going to rejoin Paris, if the Congress isn't prepared to support the kinds of measures that you need to do to implement the kinds of commitments that we made in the Paris Agreement. So I think it's important to use this time to remind ourselves why global cooperation is important, why it's in the interest of the United States to be in treaties like the Paris Climate Accord, and to build the kind of grassroots support and congressional support that we need to carry forward and to sustain it, so that we don't have these oscillations in the US involvement, and other countries will see the United States as a good and sustainable partner.
Well, Jim, thank you for joining us for that extraordinary sweep of the top to bottom and left to right in the sense of US-Chinese relations. You're an incredible resource for the country and for the world, and we're really appreciative that you beamed in with us today.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks to so many for being willing to participate remotely, and I hope everybody stays well and safe.
We look forward to bringing you back to Charlottesville. I'm going to throw it now back to Harry Harding, who is I should have mentioned, in Taipei with Shirley. They were stranded there as the pandemic broke out, and we look forward to getting them back to Charlottesville too. Harry is, as I mentioned before, a professor at the Batten School of Public Policy and Leadership here at UVA, and a senior fellow at the Miller Center. Harry, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. We're now going to start our panel discussion on the prospects for competition and cooperation in science and technology. As all of us know, the US-China relationship will most likely involve a mixture of cooperation and competition going forward, with the possibility of confrontation looming in the background as well. The competition and cooperation will play out in a variety of arenas, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. And one of the most important of these arenas will be science and technology. Our panelists today will each address one aspect of science and technology about which they are particularly knowledgeable. For the sake of time, I won't introduce them in any detail, but their biographies are on the Miller Center website, and I encourage you to take a look when you have the opportunity. In the order in which they will be making their opening remarks, they are, first, Evan Feigenbaum, the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He'll be discussing the national security challenges produced by new technologies and the prospects for both competition and cooperation between China and the United States in this area. Ying Pottinger, Senior Lab Advisor at ICAP, a program at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Policy, originally focused on AIDS prevention and treatment, and now deals with a much wider range of public health issues around the world. Before joining ICAP, she was the team lead at the HIV incidence team at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She'll discuss the prospects for Sino cooperation on COVID-19 and future pandemics. And as those of you who heard Matt Pottinger's earlier presentation and noticed the similarity in surnames, yes, Ying is Matt's wife. The next speaker will be Sam Ramasubramanian, the Vice President for Research and Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at University of Virginia. He'll be discussing the prospects for cooperation between Chinese and American researchers on solutions to other major global issues and the challenges to that cooperation posed by US government concerns around China's talent and intellectual property acquisition strategies. Finally, Ann Kokas, Assistant Professor of Media Studies and a Faculty Senior Fellow at the Miller Center and Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress. She'll be discussing today her current research under the title Border Control on the Digital Frontier, which examines the risks and opportunities surrounding the storage of personal data collected through new forms of surveillance. After the panelists make their opening remarks, the session will be moderated both by me and by Shirley Lin, who, as many of you now know, is the Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics at the Miller Center, who also teaches at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Tsinghua University in Beijing. And in the spirit of full disclosure, Shirley is my wife. Now, please feel free to post your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom throughout the panel discussions. They can be addressed to any one of the panelists or to all of them. So let's turn first to our first presentation, which is by Evan Feigenbaum. Over to you, Evan.
Great. Well, thanks, Harry, and good to see everybody in this new Zoom era. I should start with an apology. As Harry said when he introduced me, I'm this year the Schlesinger Professor at the University of Virginia in the Miller Center. I haven't done a lot of professing thanks to the virus, so it's a pleasure to be able to do this even this way. And as I've told Bill Antholis and Harry and Shirley, I'll try to make it up to you when we all get out from this semi-lockdown that we're in. As Harry said, I've been asked to talk about the national security aspects of technology. And I'm delighted to do it for two reasons. The first is that in many ways, China really has had an integrated approach to technology development for 70 years. I wrote a PhD dissertation on a book on it many, many lifetimes ago. It goes to the way technology is developed in China. It was initially a reaction to the Korean War. But it's also true, frankly, that the United States has in many ways had an integrated approach to technology. And despite the stories that we tell ourselves, the origin of many aspects of technology development in the United States, particularly in the pre-World War II period and then coming out of World War II, also owes a lot to military and civilian and commercial integration. But the second reason is that technology really, for me, encapsulates what I think is increasingly the central dynamic in the US-China relationship today, and that is the bleeding of security-related interests, concepts, and ideas into pretty much every aspect of the US-China relationship. Or to put that another way, the refracting of various interests between both the US and China through the prism of security-related competition. And I want to talk about that. I thought I would do that for you in 3, let's call them bites. First, I'll talk a little bit about the collision between economics and security. Second, about the nature of innovation and how it's changing and where the focus is, particularly in China. And last, I'll just say something quickly about what I would call the collision between Chinese impulses to indigenization and the growing impulses in the United States to what I would call de-integration. A good place to start, I think, is with a speech that Vice President Mike Pence gave. It seems like a lifetime ago now with COVID, but just last October. And he said 2 things that were interesting, but to my mind, actually flatly contradictory. In the speech, he talked a lot about technology. And I'm going to read your quote. He said that China had, quote, smashed the barriers between civilian and military technological domains. But then later in the speech, he made this rather, I think, flatly contradictory statement of policy. He said, you know, people sometimes ask whether the Trump administration seeks to decouple from China. And he said, the answer is a resounding no. Here's the problem. If the vice president is right, that China, as in his first statement, leverages all technology for military purposes, then frankly, the United States should have no interest in enabling flows of capital, people, hardware, or software that might aid in the military modernization of a competitor. So reconciling those 2 statements is part of the challenge we have. To understand why it's challenging and also what's happened, I think it's useful just to begin, and I know we'll flesh this out in the discussion, by stepping back and thinking about this in terms of those 3 bites I laid out at the outset. And I think a lot of what's happened is structural. It's not a Donald Trump phenomenon. It's not just a Xi Jinping phenomenon. A lot of it, I think, will be persistent in the US-China relationship. So first, economics and security. I think the central dynamic, frankly, in the US-China relationship increasingly is the collision between economics and security, or to put that another way, between forces of economic integration and security fragmentation. If you go back to the origin of the contemporary relationship between the United States and China, the contemporary official relationship, it began when Richard Nixon landed in Beijing in February 1972. But that was a point when the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and where China was still crawling its way out of the Cultural Revolution. So from the very inception of the contemporary relationship, the United States and China had colliding security concepts and obvious differences of political system and ideology. And the relationship developed over many decades, notwithstanding that, but it's been a feature, not a bug of the relationship. Now, that's important because particularly after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, I think a working theory of the case that a lot of people had was that economic integration would mitigate those disruptive and debilitating forces of security competition. But if you think about it, we're now, 19 years since China went in the WTO. And not only has economic integration not mitigated security competition, but if anything, security competition is getting worse. And you see that on a daily basis in the South China Sea. You see it in the Taiwan Strait. You see it all around China's periphery. You see it, frankly, in the way Matt talked a little bit about the US-China relationship, and Jim as well. So not only has economic integration not mitigated security competition, but if anything, I want to argue to you, security is now bleeding back into every other area of the relationship, disrupting flows of capital, of people, and of technology. And if you think about it, the United States and China are enormously integrated economically. Enormously integrated. They have a 700 billion plus trading relationship. There's over $100 billion in US foreign direct investment stock in China. The capital controls and other factors have reduced the Chinese deal flow into the United States. But in 2016, there was something like 50 billion in Chinese deal flow into the United States, much of that technology related, some of it into Silicon Valley growth companies. And yet, despite all that integration, including the integration of people, students, scholars, exchanges, this security competition is intensifying. So essentially, the first dynamic that you have is the refraction of so much of what should and could and was supposed to define the integration of the 2 economies, the 2 technology establishments, through the prism of security competition. And what that's meant, in effect, is that it's created a fertile ground for what I would call techno-nationalism to thrive, rather than these concepts of techno-globalism, let's call it, to simplify. Techno-nationalism, it's not a new phenomenon. There have been techno-nationalists in every country over a long time. A lot of people in the United States, when they look at China's strategic technology development plans that are state-led, for instance, in the 1980s, for example, the so-called 863 plan. Today, you hear people talking about Made in China 2025, which is a Chinese industrial plan. Those plans actually, in many ways, have been modeled on plans that have been developed in other countries. For Made in China 2025, China looked at Germany's Industry 4.0, at some of the industrial structure vision plans that METI, the Japanese Economy Ministry, has developed over time. And so in some respects, China's not different, but in others it is. But the point I want to make to you, and this is the first high-level point, is that as this security prism has bled into other areas of the relationship, it's created the opportunity for really a much more techno-national approach to technology development to thrive. And to see that, really just step back and think about what I would call the school child's, 5 W's and 1 H. What, who, where, when, why, how. What technologies do countries need to develop? A lot of the technologies that China is focused on those plans are highly strategic technologies that have dual and multiple use applications. Who then should develop them? I think both in the United States and China, there are voices and forces that argue we, not they, to put it simply, should be the ones to develop them. When should these be developed? Well, as quickly as possible. Many governments now talk about a race to the future, the race for 5G, the race for quantum. You can see this in all of the national documents that governments put out, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say to you is that the more you take a security perspective on the integration of flows of capital, of people, and technology, the more it lends itself to a much more zero-summy way of designing policies and thinking about what the other side is doing. Now that brings me to my second point, which is really about the way in which the flow of innovations in technology has changed over time. There are tales we tell ourselves in the United States about how innovation is developed. We talk about Silicon Valley as being, two people in a garage, tinkering with things, developing ideas. That is one piece of the story. But if you read a lot of the interesting scholarship on the history of science, including on the early history of Silicon Valley, it's also true, as Peter Galison, a historian of science at Harvard, has put it, that Silicon Valley prospered, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, because of plentiful sunshine and also even more plentiful government money, much of which was steered into military electronics contracts. So even in the United States, there's always been some integration between commercial innovation and military innovation and things that have multiple use applications. But if I think about the flow of innovations really from the 1940s to say the 1960s, there were a lot of ways in which military-related innovation led the development of commercial innovation. Coming out of World War II, you had these, I would call them the 4 war babies of technology. It was German rocketry, American computing, British radar, and American atomic bombs. And those 4 areas of technology really led a lot of commercial and civilian-related innovation in the late 1940s into the 1950s. But by the 1960s on, really the flow of innovations reversed. It had a lot to do with the developments around semiconductors, commercial microelectronics, and a lot of the really disruptive military innovation depended and flowed from changes in civilian and commercial innovation, really around commercial microelectronics. And so we went from conceptions of spin off from military innovation to people writing books and articles with where they coined this term spin on. And that's not surprising given the changing nature of technology and also the changing nature of weaponry in that period. So if you want to design a more effective inertial guidance system for missiles, it depended a lot on many of the innovations that happened, not in a narrowly military sense, but in the civilian sphere. If I think about how technology is evolving today, things like artificial intelligence enabled applications, new and special materials, many of the things that Chinese laboratories are seeking to develop, but also things that are happening between American and Chinese technology developers and innovators are things that have multiple applications, can be used to do all sorts of things. It's not just that they're dual use, it's that they're multiple use. And that's caught the attention, I think, of a lot of people in the United States, and particularly policymakers who look at where China is trying to develop comparative advantages, and doing it in the context of a system that, as I said at the outset, really has been quite integrated in many ways. So if you think about how innovation is evolving, it is inevitable that many of the AI-enabled applications that can be used for all sorts of exciting and interesting commercial innovations also have military applications and implications, and that's caught the attention of some American policymakers. So that brings me to my third and last point, and that really gets to where we are in the relationship. And I think, to be blunt about it, that I think on the American side, American policy is heading in a direction that I wouldn't call decoupling. And I've never liked the term decoupling because it implies that the United States and China are a couple. And in a couple, you can divorce if you're a couple, but the United States and China are not a couple because other countries get to have a vote here. And frankly, I think there are some American policies that are heading in a direction that runs the risk of trying to attenuate China's progress, but ends up sequestering a lot of technology inside the United States itself. And we can talk about that in the discussion if you'd like. But where I see American policy going, and then I'll come to Chinese policy, is really a growing emphasis on de-integration, which is a term I prefer to decoupling, that collides in many ways with impulses to what I would call indigenization in China. There are three elements of that that really I've noticed. One, and I'm just going to be blunt about it, is that I think there's a growing interest in using export controls in the United States in much more elastic and comprehensive ways that are designed, to be very candid, to attenuate China's progress with certain technologies. These are things that flow from two pieces of legislation, the Export Control Reform Act, but also the so-called Foreign Investment Risk Review and Modernization Act, that has the potential to, as I said, attenuate flows of capital in both directions, but also flows of people and flows of technology. And there are people who work on export controls in the United States who have discovered that they can expand the use of export controls in ways that were always there in a latent sense, but have become much more expansive, creative, and elastic. I'd encourage you to look, if you're interested in this, at some of the ways in which the Commerce Department is using rulemaking and executive branch action to really try, I would argue, to attenuate China's progress in certain areas of technology. That is much more challenging, I think, in a real world sense than it is in the design of rules on paper, and we can get into that as well. But I do think, frankly, that that is the intent of policy, and it has a lot of cheerleaders on a bipartisan basis across Washington, including on Capitol Hill. A second aspect of American policy that I see evolving is the attempt to, again, to be blunt about it, to reduce the exposure of US entities of all kinds, corporate, educational, and laboratory-based, to co-innovation partnerships with China. We can talk about how effective that's been in practice, but I think increasingly that's the dynamic in the conversation between the federal government on the one hand and American universities on the other. And you hear it from university presidents, you hear it from people in commercial and civilian laboratories who are, I think I'd put it bluntly, being discouraged from certain kinds of co-innovation partnerships with China. And third, there is a debate in the United States about personal data. And I assume Ann is going to get into this. But in the hearings that you see Senator Hawley, Senator Rubio, and others having about companies like TikTok. If you think TikTok, when I think about TikTok, the first thing that comes in my head is 10 and 11-year-olds at my children's school doing, videos. But if you look at the hearings on Capitol Hill, it's really about personal data and how that flows through Chinese companies and Chinese ownership. To conclude, I just flip it to the Chinese side. As I said at the beginning, I wrote a book on the development of technology in China it was written a long time ago, but I think some of the impulses that I talked about are still there. China in many ways had a highly integrated approach to technology. And if you think about the second point that I made, which is the way that dual and multiple use technology really implicates different parts of the Chinese system, as well as different parts of the American system, that really makes it harder to have just a technical debate and not a policy or a strategic debate. And I think that's what's driving technology debates in both the US and China about each other, about the trajectory of innovation, and particularly in the United States about why innovation is not just about innovation, but it also touches a whole variety of strategic questions that really get us back to some of the core issues of the US-China relationship that Jim Steinberg and Matt Pottinger were talking about that are our focus today. So in the hope that that provoked you a little bit, why don't I stop there and turn it back to Harry.
Harry, you're on mute.
We're going to be taking those questions later. I'm sorry. I said, thank you, Evan. We're already getting some questions in for you. Remind the audience to post your questions as we go through the panel discussion on the Q&A feature of Zoom. And we've already got some questions coming in for Evan. Our next speaker is Ying Pottinger at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health on the prospects for competition and cooperation on COVID-19 and future pandemics. Ying, over to you.
Great, thanks for having us today. I really want to thank you, Harry and Shirley, for inviting us, and to the Miller Center for hosting this important symposium. Before I start on my remarks, I think it's important that I respond to my husband's comment about his haircut. I'd like to remind him that his haircut is free, and if he keeps it up, I'm going to start price gouging because I cornered the market here at home. So just to move on to this topic of collaboration and competition, this is a fundamental science. It's fueled scientific discoveries through the many years, and it's I can give you great examples of both competition and collaboration. For competition, of course, we had the space race during the Cold War, which began in 1957 with the launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik, and eventually culminating in 1969 with the US putting the man on the moon. There was a race to discover the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick and Wilkins and Franklin and others to determine what we now know as the double helix. And then, of course, there are great examples of collaboration. And taking that Cold War example, when two former rivals compete, but instead work together, we get something like the International Space Station, which is made up of 5 space programs in 15 countries. Of course, another great achievement was the Human Genome Project. From 18 countries, thousands and thousands of scientists participating in that. And another one that many of our younger viewers will be familiar with is the Nuclear Research Center at CERN in Europe, consisting of 23 primarily European countries, where in 2012 they discovered the long sought after Higgs boson particle. But let's shift to collaboration and competition in the age of coronavirus. While our leaders exchange some rhetoric, the scientists at their core collaborate. US and China have had a long history of collaborating. It dates back to 1941, when both countries signed a US-China Science and Technology Agreement cooperation, renewed again in 2001 under Obama. And it is a robust government-to-government collaboration where dozens of agencies over the years have worked together and collaborated. And in terms of epidemics, the US and China really have been collaborating on many of the previous epidemics. SARS in 2003, Ebola in 2014 in West Africa, and pandemic flu and HIV. And these two I'm going to give you a little more background on. China and the US really began their flu collaboration beginning in 2004 through 2014. They worked to develop a very robust flu surveillance system in China, consisting of an early response, early detection system. The program trained tens of thousands of public health officials, and they worked together to ramp up the testing platforms so that now they can run tens of thousands of tests throughout the year. And in fact, the genetic sequences from the Chinese epidemic each year is submitted to WHO to help inform the vaccine development. And this, by and large, was a very successful collaboration. Like Harry mentioned, I'm an HIV specialist. I've been working in PEPFAR for quite a while. And so I'm most familiar with the US-China HIV collaboration. And it began in 2012 under George W. Bush, eventually folded into PEPFAR. And PEPFAR, for those who don't know, is the the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, began under George W. Bush. I think one of his gifts to humanity. It is the U.S. government's fund for global HIV. And that was in 2006. And up into 2015, we really had a large staff out of the Beijing embassy who worked with China CDC and other health agencies to build the HIV program in China. And here's where I want to get a little personal story of collaboration. So during my time at CDC, we had a researcher in 2009, his name was Maofan Qiao, and he came to my lab and joined for 6 months and participated in the research and was instrumental in the early days of developing an HIV incidence assay. And an incidence assay measures essentially when you might have gotten infected. And he was such a hard worker, and his work was very important. He's a co-author on our paper. And after 6 months, returned to China CDC. And then a few years later, when the test was commercially available, I returned the favor and went to Beijing to train the China CDC staff on the test, provided technical assistance to companies in Beijing who wanted to make the test locally. And so I think that in its essence, this is what a really healthy, mutually beneficial collaboration looks like at the working level. But the work actually had major impact in public health. In PEPFAR, we use this assay now to measure HIV incidence worldwide. Countries who aren't part of PEPFAR also use it. So, that contribution, though small, actually had a very large impact on the field. But let's really talk about coronavirus and future pandemics. And the message I really want to convey here is that only through timely, transparent, and unrestricted research are we really going to beat this virus and any other future virus that comes our way? And without a doubt, another pandemic will come, whether it's a coronavirus or a flu virus or a virus we don't know about, another pandemic, of course, will come. And we saw in the early days of this pandemic that the Chinese were actually very forthcoming with data. Researchers from Shanghai released the genetic sequences of the virus that they isolated. And this was extremely important. It provided the blueprint for companies to make diagnostic tests that the WHO then made available to basically, or resource limited countries around the world. In early February, if you went on Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, at that time, papers were getting pumped out from China with data that was extremely important for doctors and researchers worldwide as the virus was starting to take hold in other places outside of China. Now, this is a very unique burden for countries where outbreaks begin. And, it could be Brazil of the Zika virus in 2015, but the country where these outbreaks begin, they have a special responsibility to really share data early, unfiltered to the global community so that people can prepare for when the virus hits their shores and do work that is needed to fight the virus around the world. And I've seen an incredible shift in the global scientific community on this. And I've never seen it before, where all of a sudden the secrecy that surrounds usually academic medical research or even just, very high throughput labs, that notion's kind of fallen away where you get the sense that we're all in this together now, and all of that stuff we can save it for later, but we have a bigger problem that's affecting everyone. It's affecting people we know, and it's all hands on deck. Without this recognition for credit or first to discovery, it's a very impressive and really heartwarming sense for the scientific community to know that we really are all in this together. And to give you an example of that, there's a website that was used for flu sequence monitoring for the year-round flu monitoring that now is tracking the coronavirus. There have to date over 16,000 full-length genomic sequences have been submitted to the site. So you can really track how the virus is moving through different populations, geographically and over time. I think, it's an incredible pace at which people are sharing data. But what what are the questions we still need to answer, and where do we need continual cooperation, and where might a little competition be good? I think the most basic and simple question, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to have the same question, is where did this virus come from? It's important, and I'm going to give this important from a public health perspective and not a political perspective, is that we have to understand this so that we can prevent this from happening in the future, right? Did it come from a bat through another animal to humans? What circumstances? Was it a wet market? Was it people collecting samples in a cave? Or was this a lab accident? And from my perspective, not to be punitive, but so that we can make changes to prevent future zoonotic transmission that really disrupt our entire global community. And so, that's a burden upon China to help answer, since the virus began there. And of course, now we know that the government is preventing all of that research from coming out, which is unfortunate. But I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do there, and a lot of questions we have to answer for that. And of course, where we need to work collectively is in the clinical trials and in the vaccine development. But this is also where a little competition might be good, either through countries and private companies, through nationalism or pride, are all pushing to be the first to develop a vaccine. And that's okay, as long as, if it gets us there faster. But we definitely need to hold countries and companies accountable to make sure that if a vaccine, an effective and safe vaccine, and I would say the most safe vaccine if everyone on the planet is going to get it, is available to everyone without exception, and that profits certainly don't come first here. And so I really just want to leave with one thought here. George W. Bush said yesterday in a video he released that, we are facing a shared enemy, and that couldn't be better said. And the only way to win against this virus is through science, right? We're all buying time until we have a vaccine or a knockout drug. And any collaboration success has to be built on the shared notion of shared mission and shared values with transparency at its core. And of course, have leadership commitment. So I'll leave it there, and we can discuss more in the Q&A. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ying. I appreciated your emphasis on the importance of collaboration and cooperation in various areas with regard to viral pandemics. You're pointing out that actually some healthy competition could be a good thing. That's an important thing to keep in mind. But also you're mentioning that there are some obstacles that are obstructing the necessary collaboration and cooperation. And that's a good lead into our next speaker, Ram Ramasubramanian, the Vice President for Research at UVA, who will talk about the challenges to cooperation posed by US government concerns about China's talent and intellectual property acquisition strategies. Ram, over to you.
Thank you, Harry and Shirley, and the Miller Center for inviting me to this distinguished group of panelists. I enjoyed the conversation so far on this topic. It's a perfect lead in. The prospects for collaboration in the context of these recent US government concerns on China talent, intellectual property acquisition strategies is going to be the focus of my discussion. I plan to talk on 4 areas. First, we're going to look at where does US-China science and technology collaboration stand. This goes beyond this recent, necessary to collaborate, et cetera, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a history on where we stand and discuss the concerns and put that in context, and talk about going forward, how can we protect this collaboration that is necessary for science and technology while recognizing the threats posed by the acquisition programs, et cetera. And finally, I plan to talk about the status of competition between the United States and China. There is competition and collaboration. It's a fine line, and as Ian said, there are places where you have to compete, which is healthy, and there are places where we should collaborate. So I have some ideas of strategy more on a broader scale and not specific to a topic. So let's talk about collaboration between United States and China. And by the way, my talk is restricted to science and technology, more on the basic science of research. So that's the lens I wear at the university. And so from that lens, when you look at if US-China relationship in science and technology is quite strong. So if you use the co-authorship as a surrogate data for collaboration in basic science, you can observe that the US authors collaborated most frequently with authors from China. And in fact, it's about 26% of all international co-authored papers are with the Chinese. The collaboration with China not only advances science, but also increased our US research productivity between periods of 2014 and 2018. There's numerous scholarly studies done on this topic of assessing collaboration. And when you look at the data, the increase in research productivity was by 2.6%, more papers published as a result of the collaboration. So our scientific enterprise is benefiting purely by the collaboration, even by the numbers. Now, from a Chinese point of view, the United States collaboration is highly valued. And in fact, US is its #1 international collaborator. The second in line, if you compare EU with the United States, the number of co-authored publications between the US and China versus EU and China is a ratio of 3 to 1. So clearly we see mutual benefits for collaboration. And as the previous Ian said, I mean, collaboration is absolutely essential. I'll make the case. Now, let's talk about recent allegations and evidences produced by the US government that China is taking advantage of our culture of openness in scientific research to their benefit and using unfair and illegal practices. All of you in this community are familiar with this bipartisan report by Senator Rob Portman and Tom Carper, released in November 2019, essentially provides a detailed account of the methods used, the talent programs, and how the process worked, and with specific examples, including the 1,000 Talent Program. So when the methods described are quite egregious, when you look at it closely, some, if not all, the recruits applied for this program. So they did this voluntarily, applied for this program, and knowingly that these terms violate our norms of honesty, integrity, and ethical conduct. And in those instances, these individuals, I am all for justice and penalizing to the fullest extent of the law. Now, when you look at the extent of this problem, when you hear these stories, you get alarmed, which we should be. But when you look at the stories, at the time of writing the report, there were 75 cases under investigation and by the NIH alone. And in context, NIH supports 300,000 researchers. So it's the scale of the problem, although it is serious, it is individual centric. So it is by that count, I can clearly say that most researchers, domestic and foreign born, uphold the American values of research integrity and play by the rules. So institutions and funding agencies have been working in the past year from my role as Vice President for Research. I'm intimately involved in this process on revamping our disclosure requirements. If you look at several of the convictions, the individual researcher did not simply say that they have this appointment in China, for example. So how can we correct these and bring a disclosure system with enforcement strategies to address the concern is something that we do. In fact, at UVA, University of Virginia, we have revised our conflict of interest policies and procedures to include explicit questions on foreign relationships, whether paid or unpaid, and any resources that they have abroad that they should disclose in the conduct of research, federally funded research in the United States at UVA. We also provide do's and don'ts, and maybe consult with us when in doubt type of directions to the entire research community. So the early reaction to this was, can I do this? Can I wrote a paper for a conference in China, can I go? But these types of, it really set back people from once they read this report, can I even work? I mean, this kind of reminds us of when classified research came to being in the 80s. There simple faculty said, no, this is too complicated. I don't want to work on that anymore. Really takes bright minds away from these topics. So I think educating our folks on what the perils are and what they should do when they get these contracts, and how can they disclose it, and what is legitimate, what's not, is something that an institution has to do. And we are doing that. Many institutions have implemented these policies already. Now, the report talks about restricting fundamental research as a means of ensuring national security in some areas is something that caught my attention and worried me quite a bit. And as Yun said in the previous talk, free flow of knowledge and science is necessary, and anything that we do to restrict will impede scientific progress, period. Basic research, in fact, by definition, is understanding of laws of nature. And often this happens through collective wisdom by building on each other's ideas. In fact, I wouldn't even know my idea is correct until somebody else validates it. For that, I have to disclose it fully with data so they can reproduce and tell me that I was right. So that is the kind of scenario that we worry about if we even try to shape restrict fundamental research any which way. So behind closed doors, basic science has little chance of advancing. So I've summarized my thought. Let me see if I can share my screen here. I think right there. Okay, here it is. So when we look at what are the strategies in light of the political sensitivity, the rhetoric, and I've talked about the size and scale, we have to, and we are already doing, and some have done, strengthening institutional conflict of interest policies and procedures to include foreign affiliations. I mentioned that. The second piece is clear, transparent, verifiable, agreement-based approach. With international collaboration, we have nation-to-nation collaboration, agency-agency collaboration. What about institution collaboration? What about collaboration, PI-to-PI collaboration? How can the institution get involved in that? Because faculty have the freedom to work wherever they want. I mean, that's, but they do have the guidelines of not violating the policies of the funding agency, the requirements they have, the ideas of clear-cut commitment so that they don't enter into conflict of commitments in any which way. So how can we support this is a strategy and an important element of fostering collaboration. Through workshops and celebration of exemplary behavior, and goes with it, punitive for bad behavior. Instilling American research values of integrity, rigor, reproducibility to our researchers on a repeated basis with workshops really keeps this topic up there so that they can navigate through this while continuing all their collaborations that they have to pursue science. But finally, there was talks about this. This is when institution cannot get a level playing field, multiple institutions cannot in areas of technology, etc. Certainly political trade negotiations and other things that the federal government as a whole can do for the nation can help level the playing field in whatever terms we think about. So that data is shared with integrity, timely, which is rigorous and reproducible. So that's something that we can talk about. So now let me talk about the competition element of it. So I want to talk about why this is urgent and what are the prospects of succeeding with our competition. I want to bring your attention to these two graphs. I call on the left-hand side, this is the input side where research expenditures in the country. As you see, United States as of 2017, it's at $550 billion, and Chinese investments at 500. And they have grown at a 17% clip, continuous investment in basic, in science, both science and technology development. And we have grown as well. And early indications are that the total investments have exceeded the United States, but confirmation needs to be heard. On the right-hand side, what does it mean with this type of basic science, investment in R&D at this intensity and scale over a short period of time? If you look at our market share of technologies that are high technology, R&D specific, R&D dependent technologies such as aerospace industries, software, pharmaceuticals, etc. We had a 38% market share, and we are at 32% in 2018. When you look at this, Chinese market share from 6% has grown into 21. So clearly you can see the input to output correlation. This is not the only input. There's quite a few others, but this is an important element to keep in mind. This is the core of the problem. As a prosperous nation, for national prosperity and security, these types of industries are the industries of the future, where our market share should not shrink. We should have the pie should grow, but our market share should be significant. Is a notion that I want to advance here. Now, in terms of total number of publications, bachelor's degrees produced, etc. Yes, China by the numbers, they have surpassed us. But one important element of this intellectual quest, this is kind of points to Yun's first to discover idea. When you look at the impact of the research that we do, United States is far above anybody else. This is the top 1% cited papers among the papers that people publish. And the theory is if your work is citable, it's generally reproducible, it's correct, it's good, it is in the right direction, and you get the citation. So I think building this capacity to more through investments, increasing our capacity on highly citable, valuable index is an important feed into technology development. The more understanding you have of a basic science and of which that is correct and workable, you have technology development built on that will succeed. So this is an input that we have to pay in our fundamental research quest. Okay. When we look at how we invest, I have what I plan to do here to finish up is discuss 3 strategies for effective competition here and competing in a way that we can the previous chart that I showed, the industries of the future, we have a significant component of that as a global market share. The big pie can grow. That's not the concern. So when we look at the investments, the industry investments in R&D has passed and really grew over the past decade in the United States, whereas the federal funding for R&D, which usually significantly funds the university basic research, is flat, and in this decade is a slight decrease. But what's most importantly noted is the proportion has decreased substantially in 15 years. Now, industry generally funds and works on more on the experimental side, more on close to commercialization, applied research onward, and the basic sciences are the input to that entity here. Some targeted industries do their own basic research and continue on when they're very specific to technology. But as our outstanding researchers work on various types of ideas, highly impactful research comes out, the handholding from there to an innovation is not currently well done in the United States. And that's where China invests 85% of their R&D investments in the space of taking the ideas and discoveries into innovation. And that space and hand-holding ideas and de-risking the technology is the function of the US government if you want to truthfully compete and succeed, have the prospect of succeeding with China. And I think I can envision this curve somewhat here in between, so closer to what the industries do, but then have a component of this that not only funds fundamental research, we have to double up on that, but really think about the innovation, and at the same time, the innovations that can be brought back into innovations that are needed. Industries of the future can inform what basic research has to be done. The second and third are quickly, I'm going to go through. This is the workforce development. We know that 30% of our doctoral workforce is foreign, and we have to produce domestic talent to have our enterprise stable.
I hate to interrupt, but we're running a little short on time. Can you finish up, please?
Absolutely. Again, the Chinese students are the most number of PhDs that we produce. We need to retain them. The stay rates is declining, which is something we need to think about. I want to leave it there. So the collaboration is beneficial. Our concerns can be handled through institutional policies at individual level, individual institutional level, and working with agencies for intensification of investment, domestic STEM talent, retaining more foreign talent in the United States will give us the best prospects. Sorry, I went over time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ram. And now, last but not least, we're going to turn to Ann Kokas for a presentation on her current research project. We've already touched on this, and certainly it's related to COVID, the idea that we are collecting all kinds of data, massive amounts of data from people all over the world. But we see with the case of COVID that the ability to track people may be really important to managing and bringing this outbreak under control. So again, there are possibilities for both good and bad cooperation and competition. And Annie, you're working on an important and interesting topic. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Harry, and thank you, Shirley. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I feel very grateful to Bill Antholis and Stephanie Jacques Abbott at the Miller Center for helping to make this amazing event. So actually, my talk will be building on what Ram was discussing with regard to the movement of data between countries, as well as what Evan was talking about with regard to these questions of techno-nationalism and techno-globalism. And I'd like to think about this as a discussion of the movement of consumer data in 3 commonly used COVID platforms. So basically thinking about the movement of consumer data between China and the US in 3 platforms that have really come to a lot of prominence over the past few months as we've been inside. So one of the central features of the 21st century economy is the gathering and monetization of consumer data. The US-China economic relationship is no exception. And indeed, Chinese firms are able to gather consumer data in the United States, but most US firms do not have that same reciprocal opportunity in China. Now, a lot of this emerges as a result of 2 very different systems for data governance. Within China, we see something called cyber sovereignty, this idea that data gathered and generated by Chinese firms is the property of part of the Chinese state. And we see how this functions through a variety of different policy mechanisms that the Chinese government has introduced over the past 10 years. A lot of this discussion began in the 2010 white paper on the Chinese internet, this idea of cyber sovereignty, though I'm sure Evan can go into much greater detail about the kind of historical origins of a lot of these questions. In 2017, we see the emergence of China's cybersecurity law, which required any personal or important information generated within China to be stored in Chinese government-owned servers. So this includes iCloud data, Apple iCloud data that was generated within China. Now, as Evan alluded, we also see this occurring at the backdrop of the phenomenon of military-civil fusion, or the ability of the Chinese government to leverage the resources of Chinese firms for military purposes. And there's a lot of debate about the extent of military-civil fusion and how it functions, but I think it's at a very minimum we can agree that it's a feature of Chinese cyber sovereignty. Now, within the U.S. context, we see less techno-nationalism, and there is a shift in this, but there's much more of a focus as a result of our multi-stakeholder system on the role of corporations in guiding data governance practices. So we see that corporations work in public-private partnerships through things like NIST, through organizations like NIST, to establish data security standards. We also see a hesitance to regulate corporate data in an effort to stimulate innovation within the US context. Now, this limited domestic oversight within the US has led to a very small number of national data regulations. So this includes HIPAA for the regulation of health information, and CHAPA for the regulation of the data of children, so anyone 13 or younger. And as Evan pointed out earlier, there's also FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which allows for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to oversee acquisitions of companies within the United States. And I'll be talking a little bit about CFIUS, that committee, in my discussion today. Now, this is in all of these, the difference between how China manages consumer data and how the US manages consumer data is really important, because this consumer data serves as the backbone of key strategic interests for the 21st century. Intelligence gathering, the education of machine learning algorithms for AI, and the development of new economies of scale for products of services, among others. Now, using 3 stories of apps and platforms that we may have become even more familiar with during COVID, I'd like to share how the US and Chinese digital economies will remain entwined and how this impacts the economic and security landscape of the 21st century. So some of you may be isolating with friends or with family. Some people might be isolating by themselves, and they might be doing online dating as a part of their COVID experience. So the first thing that I'll be talking about today is Grindr, the world's largest LGBTQ+ dating app, which has actually seen an increase in usage over the past few months. Now, Grindr is a really interesting case because in 2016, Beijing Kunlun Tech acquired 60% of the firm. And then in 2018, they acquired the entire firm. As we discussed with regard to the cybersecurity law, that data, the data from Grindr was then moved to China and stored on Chinese government-run servers. Now, this includes the type of data that one might imagine would be on a dating app. So texts, images, video, HIV status, a wide range of very kind of intimate personal details about people based in the US and elsewhere. Now, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States in 2019 required the divestment of Grindr by Beijing Kunlun Tech. But the part that's really challenging about this, and when we're looking at the relationship between cyber sovereignty and the multi-stakeholder framework, is that ultimately the data had already been moved. So this patchwork created a system where a large amount of very personal, intimate data could be transferred across borders. Now, there has been an agreement to move forward with the divestment. So in March of this year, San Vicente Acquisitions offered $608 million for the divestment of Grindr, which Grindr agreed to. However, this hasn't been moved forward through the CFIUS process, which, as Evan alluded to, is a kind of complex bureaucratic framework that needs to be made a little bit more, or that could be more lean in terms of the evaluation of individual deals. So the US is dealing with a lot of kind of historical and legacy policy frameworks that don't necessarily have enough resources behind them to deal with the challenging technological landscape that we're facing right now. So moving from Grindr and moving from the experience of online dating during COVID, some of you might be trying to entertain yourselves while you're on your couch at home or with your kids, and maybe you're using TikTok. So TikTok during this past period has just passed 2 billion users. TikTok is owned by Beijing-based ByteDance. It's a Chinese-owned social platform that was the second most downloaded platform in the United States in the fourth quarter of 2019. It also had 30 million US-based users as of December 2019, 60% of which are in that marketing sweet spot of ages 16 to 24. So this firm is now becoming the backbone of the US media economy, a backbone of the US media economy, despite being owned by a Beijing-based firm, which presents some challenges with regard to the equality and reciprocity in regard to economic development between the US and China. So when we look at a company like TikTok, not only is TikTok able to operate globally, but they also have an equivalent platform in China called Douyin, which also is able to gather similar types of data about users. So so security questions aside, the types of user data that ByteDance is able to gather on their platforms exceeds the potential capacity for user data that ByteDance is able to gather exceeds that of US social media platforms, because they're simply not allowed to operate within the Chinese context. Now, that being said, we are already also seeing serious privacy issues related to TikTok. So TikTok has already settled with the Federal Trade Commission for $5.8 million as a result of violation of one of the few national data privacy regulations in the US, that being CHAPA, for child online data. So just for those parents out there, you may want to pay attention to that. But what we're seeing is not just the expansion of economies of scale, but the type of data that TikTok is able to gather also facilitates the development of, as Evan was talking about, these dual use technologies. So one interesting example is TikTok's Face Swap app. So it's this fun app that you can use within TikTok to change your face with someone else's face, which provides endless hours of entertainment. It also helps to train TikTok's AI algorithm on how to effectively generate deep fakes of people's faces. So as we're talking about these dual use technologies and the relationship between, as Evan was discussing, techno-nationalism and techno-globalism, it becomes a really challenging question about what types of platforms should be allowed to gather the data, or what types of platforms should be allowed to gather the data of US consumers, how that data can be used, where it should be stored, and the features of the US model, the features of the multi-stakeholder model, really favor the growth and the expansion of firms at the expense of kind of long-term security planning. So this really is a moment in which the United States, as well as China and other countries, need to think very critically about how data is managed in each of our individual countries because of the potential security implications. Now, the third platform that I'd like to talk about as part of this very meta commentary is Zoom, the platform that we are currently on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Zoom. So Zoom is based in the US. They have an IPO here, in an initial public offering of their stock options here in the United States. However, they also have servers in China. And over the past few months, there have been questions raised about how data from Zoom and how data from Zoom is routed, where it goes, where it is ultimately stored. This has been such a concern that actually Taiwan no longer allows the official conduct of business on Zoom because of concerns about where Zoom data is routed. And there are currently, the UK Parliament is currently using Zoom. We learned about how Boris Johnson actually had his Zoom handle or his Zoom meeting ID shared on Twitter. The US Congress is considering this. So the pervasiveness of these technologies combined with the potential security risks presents a really interesting challenge to the US multi-stakeholder model in relation to China's cyber sovereignty model. Now, today I talked about social media and communications platforms. And the reason that I wanted to talk about these is because it's something we can kind of all grab onto. These might be things that many of us are using or are familiar with. But it is not just it's not just social media platforms that are gathering data in the US and sharing them in China. There are a wide range of consumer technology firms, white goods firms, so like dishwashers, smart dryers, smart home appliances, drones, a wide variety of other consumer goods, smart infrastructure firms, broadband. So we've talked a lot about Huawei and other discussions. And these firms are doing similar things that are challenging what it means for the multi-stakeholder model to continue operating in the US in relation to China's cyber sovereignty model. Now, the US so far has been making the decision to avoid comprehensive data regulations in response. So we see the California Consumer Privacy Act, so certain state level regulations, but that doesn't necessarily allow for a nation state level response. By failing to comprehensively regulate how US consumer data is stored and moved, the US is ultimately facilitating Chinese corporate and government efforts to move data to China, an act which leaves the United States in a fundamentally uncompetitive or less competitive position as we move forward in the 21st century economy. And with that, I'd like to thank Zoom for facilitating this conversation, even though I was rather critical as part of my remarks. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the panelists. We're excited to be able to move into the Q&A now. There's some excellent questions, but I'd like to start off by first asking a common question for all four of our panelists. I'll start with Ying, who has a unique question because you're already addressing the pandemic. But what do you think of the WHO's role in the pandemic, and what do you think they should be doing both now and with regard to future pandemics? And for the other three panelists, and I'd like to go from Anne to Evan and then to Ram. The common question I like to pose is, the panel is focused on the prospect for cooperation and competition in the US-China relationship. And we're all aware that confrontation is another possibility, as reflected in the recent trade war between them and in their military interactions in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. So how does the COVID pandemic affect their overall relationship and the balance among cooperation, competition, and confrontation? In the end, will the pandemic force cooperation between the two countries as the optimists hope, or will it trigger a second Cold War as the pessimists fear? In other words, is this pandemic a game changer? So Ying, if you could start.
Sure, thanks for the question on the WHO. I'm sure it's on a lot of people's mind. Just a brief history, the WHO has been around for over 7 years, began after World War II, and in its constitution is really to lead, to act as the directing and coordinating authority on international health work, right? That's at its core. It's got a very large budget, $6.3 billion the last 2-year budget, the US being the major contributor, followed by, surprisingly, the Gates Foundation and then the UK. And in its normal job, it sets normative guidelines for countries ranging on all sorts of diseases. I've worked with WHO for well over a decade on HIV. And that's, the core of their mission is to provide guidance and norms for countries to follow based on best practices and good science. And the WHO in many of its programs have had great successes. I mean, if you think about the smallpox eradication in the late 70s, or the near eradication of polio this past decade, and child vaccination programs, but it's also had some major setbacks, and we saw that during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, where they were very slow to respond. In terms of this pandemic, I think the WHO is doing a lot of things right. That includes providing technical guidance, providing test kits around the world, especially in resource countries. In many of the PEPFAR countries I work with on a daily basis and communicate with, they're using WHO kits for testing potential COVID infections. So they're playing an instrumental role, especially in the resource limited countries. And along with test kits, you have PPE and all of these things that are important in testing and isolating COVID patients. But there have been a number of criticisms lobbed against them. And in general, from my own experience, the WHO is always slow to act. They take a more cautious approach generally. They're always behind on the curve to putting out guidance, because they want to make sure that whatever they put out is going to hold, and science later won't prove them wrong or whatever. They just like to make sure that whatever they put out is right, and that often means being slow to act. And so and we saw that here. I think that they were slow to declare a global pandemic when it was so obvious that it was a global pandemic. So there are things that they're going to have to do when they reflect on their actions. I am, for one, am about reform of the institution. I think that the WHO has a very important role to play in the world of health, and people, PEPFAR countries, other countries look to the WHO for advice, for guidance, and that needs to continue. But there's no question that some reforms, maybe including leadership changes, are needed at the institution. It's highly bureaucratic, it's slow to get things done. And frankly, we can't have them, lagging in a world crisis like this. And I'm sure, because this is a China forum, that we can address the issue of how their criticism about them pandering to China, with one Japanese official saying that it's actually the China Health Organization. And people defend this by saying, well, they had to be nice, so that China would let them in. But what if they had gone about it a slightly different way and they said to China, we won't take no for an answer. We deserve to get answers from you. We want to enter your country so we can get some answers. And this is true for not just China, but the WHO needs to call out countries, including the US. We're not immune to this, but to apply pressure, be critical, give credit where it's due, and to really be an honest broker as opposed to being, placating and hoping that goodwill will get them what they want. So those are my thoughts on WHO.
Thank you, Ying. Anne, on
Yes.
the common question of what the pandemic is doing to the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's tearing at the fibers of the relationship on a very fundamental level. We're seeing a relationship that was already tense and in crisis becoming ever more frayed as a result of national pressures that individual leaders are facing, both Trump and Xi. And under national crises, a traditional common tactic is to reach out and to try to blame the other or to blame a competitor. So on a political level, we're seeing huge challenges there. On a scientific level, as Ying was pointing out, I am still quite hopeful that there might be the opportunity for collaboration because of, as what Ram was discussing earlier, and what we've seen at UVA and through the WHO, this kind of continued interest in collaboration between US and Chinese scientists. And so I think that we really have to hope that that can be the core of the relationship moving forward. This kind of collaboration between leaders in individual fields that identify particular challenges. Now, as I articulated in my talk, there are kind of strategic challenges with regard to industrial collaboration that are becoming even more significant during this time. But hopefully we can really build on the scientific collaboration as during the period of the pandemic in particular.
Thank you, Anne. Evan?
Okay, what is COVID doing to the relationship? I think we should start by talking about the state of the relationship. From my vantage point, an intellectually honest appraisal of the state of the relationship is that essentially it's in free fall. And as far as I can tell, there doesn't appear to be a floor right now. The reason I say that is, as I said at the beginning, if you look at the entire trajectory of the US-China relationship since 1972, security competition and clashing security concepts have always existed. And so too have obvious differences of political system and ideology. So what connected these two countries and created a relationship? It was flows of goods, capital, people, and technology. And for a variety of reasons, flows of goods, capital, people, and technology are being attenuated by policies, reciprocal, retaliatory, and unilateral on both sides. And if you restrict or attenuate flows of goods, capital, people, and technology, what you're left with is, as I said, the security competition and the obvious differences of political system and ideology. So that brings us to COVID, because it begs the question, if that's the trajectory of the relationship, what would arrest that and induce cooperation? And what I would say to you rhetorically is that if collaboration on the worst public health and prospectively economic crisis since the Second World War cannot produce a high degree of cooperation between these two, then I would ask you rhetorically, what can produce a high degree of cooperation between those two? Nothing. So I look at what's happening now, and what I see is an entrenching and reinforcement, as Anne said, of existing patterns in the relationship that have created a prism of debilitating competition and are driving the general trajectory of the relationship downward. Now that's ironic, and this is an important point to make, because the United States and China actually have a long history of coordination, though not necessarily cooperation, on scary transnational threats. In 2008, it was to prevent financial contagion in the global financial crisis. In 2014, It was to stop an Ebola outbreak at the source in Africa. And I can give you other examples as well. So notwithstanding their strategic competition and these differences, they've nonetheless found their way to coordinate in the past. And when I look at the current situation, frankly, that's not what I see. So I wrote a piece last week titled How the United States and China Forgot How to Cooperate. And both sides are in a sense guilty of this. And so when I look at what could arrest that, to be candid, I look to third parties. I think in many instances, it's really third countries that will backfoot the United States, China, or both of them by presenting them as the spoilers to international collective action. That is the only thing I see at this point in time that's going to arrest the downward spiral that I see in the context of the pandemic. So my short answer to you would be that rather than knocking the current trajectory of the relationship off the current course, I come out in the same place that Anne did. It's entrenching, reinforcing, and deepening these debilitating patterns that I see happening in the relationship. And I think, frankly, that's what we're heading for. And that's why I put so much emphasis in the presentation I made in the setup on the kind of securitization of the relationship. Because economic competition doesn't have to be zero sum. Military competition is, and so the more you refract it through that prism, the more debilitating the dynamic will be. And if you thought the pandemic was going to change that, I'm not seeing it.
Thank you, Evan. It's a good time to remind everyone, you can go to the Miller Center website to look for Evan's publication, as well as Anne's. They're both fellows at the center, and they've been writing a lot. So on that note, Ram.
Yes, there's an advantage to going last on this question. How has COVID-19 affected our overall relationship? And then you look at the cooperation, competition, and confrontation. As we discussed earlier, global scientific community is racing to understand how the virus spreads, development of therapeutics, vaccine, and do this as efficiently as possible without sacrificing scientific rigor, because without that we don't have anything, and that's happening throughout the world. So unquestionably, the call to collaborate to address this pandemic, and a bit of friendly competition always exists among scientists. First one to discover, first person to be on the news media to say, I've got this. That's okay, as Yun said, that's okay, as long as we get it's openly shared. The results are shared so others can build on it. So this is not as Dr. Fauci said, from the NIAID trial, that the remdesivir showed that it can block the virus. That's it. But this is the building block. This is not the end in itself. This is the beginning. So here, the question of collaboration and competition is simultaneously happening here. Now, who will be the person who takes the idea, now can make hypothesis? If remdesivir works, what is the hypothesis as to what hypothesis I can make for the mechanism of how the virus works? And it could be in the United States, it could be in China, it could be in Japan, and it could be in India or anywhere else. And that result that we see, honestly, I don't know who would be bringing out the next step, building on something that has worked. But whoever discusses this, it is the hope of the scientific community, and again, our values are certainly that we will share quickly, just very quickly and completely what we did, and as long as it's a rigorously reproducible result. Just as we did with Dr. Fauci sitting in the White House with the President of the United States, and the President reinforcing the idea that, yes, this is a building block, this needs to grow. So I think the global scientific community will be integrated much more closely as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And this the friendly competition to be the first one to discover will always exist. That is the lifeblood for scientists, but that's not going to compromise collaboration. Confrontation is the last thing I could think of in this pathway. The lens that I'm wearing, I don't see confrontation in any which way.
Thank you, Ram. Well, that's good. We have an optimist on this panel. We like to take a little bit more time to ask each of you an individual question from the audience, and we may be running out of time. So if we could keep those answers brief. So we are going to start with a question from the audience for Ying.
Right. Hi, Ying. This comes from Karen Greb, and she says, all of these viruses are zoonotic in nature. Do you feel that wet markets should be shut down worldwide as the WHO has recommended? And do you feel that we are also at risk in the United States with factory farming?
So I do agree that the wet markets, for many reasons, should be restricted. But just to be clear, a wet market just means like there are animals, right? Like there's fish and pigs and pork and beef, like things that you would see at a grocery store, but in an outdoor open kind of market. And not all wet markets have turtles and pangolins and bats and all of these things, right? So I think we have to be careful to say all wet markets. I mean, these are places where people go to shop to get food and nutrition. So but I certainly support the restriction of these animals that we don't know a lot about that are part of illegal trade. And here in the US, there have been instances of factories, meat producing factories that have led to some diseases. You can go to the literature for that. And they're not coronaviruses, and they were very restricted to the people working in the plants. So anytime we're dealing with animals in any way, these things can happen, definitely.
Thank you, Ying.
Okay, now we have a question for Ram. This questioner, like me, was interested in your emphasis on the way in which collaborative work training Chinese and other international students and scholars in the US can inculcate the research values that we consider to be very important. And so Melissa Ruckmick asks, even though individual scientific researchers may have integrity, isn't really the issue what happens with their information, with the results of their research, implying that they may not control it. In fact, they may lose control of the findings that they have discovered.
Yes, the whole tenet of fundamental research is freely publishing the results. So sooner or later, you're going to publish incompleteness, the research discoveries that you made, and the more impactful it is, the more citations and so on. So I'm not worried about the basic. I'm again limiting to basic fundamental research of discovery. Discovery for the sake of discovery work should be published. So I don't see a problem with working with integrity, producing the results, and announcing to the world that's what we have done is the way scientists work. So I don't see a problem of. In fact, the problem would be if you start to limit, have someone else have value judgment on this is going to be useful for this or that, and limit this. That will eventually very quickly stifle the openness and development of further ideas.
We have questions that I think apply to both you, Ram, and to Anne about whether the guidelines that you have spoken of, the need for guidelines, Ram, with regard to the restrictions being placed by the US government on research. You said that we could work within reasonable guidelines. Anne has talked about the need for guidelines regarding the collection of personal information and control of that. What are the prospects, both of them are asking, for commonly accepted, really universal guidelines in these two critical areas?
Anne, you want to go ahead?
Okay, sure. So there are a couple of so I think that as I talked about in my presentation, there are a lot of industrial forces that work against the idea of more rigorous data privacy and storage regulations. This idea of data provenance, how we can trace data that's gathered about individual consumers, because it's expensive and it reduces potential market size for a lot of different products. That being said, I hope I tried to articulate the reasons why this is not just a domestic privacy issue, but also an international security issue. There are a couple of kind of pieces of low-hanging fruit that could be addressed. So for example, New York State already has financial regulations on the books that apply to the financial industry in New York State. Those could be expanded domestically within the US. The California Consumer Privacy Act, which is a much more watered down version of the general data protection regulations in Europe, took effect in January 2020. Now, the interesting part about that is that a lot of companies, because of this corporate resistance to data privacy oversight in the US, have said that they are not actually going to adhere to CCPA until there are court cases that adjudicate what the actual limits are. Now, this becomes particularly challenging in the current moment, where a lot of essential court cases have stopped being heard. So that really has extended the length of time for CCPA to become active. The other part that's really that's important there is that we can hope that we might see economies of scale within the US context, where specific companies might choose to change their patterns of behavior as a result of the kind of large California market, but that's not certain. The other thing that I really want to emphasize here that I think is extremely important, particularly given our discussion of the World Health Organization and the role that international organizations play in this, is that the US has been pulling back from participation in international standards-making organizations like the United Nations, International Telecommunications Union, among many others. And I think that that greater participation in these organizations allows, as Evan was talking about, for third-party backstops for this to not just be a US-China issue, but to be a global issue of data storage and security.
Ron, would you like to speak to this question?
Yeah, from a data security point of view, we are asked to protect research data at institutions as we generate research data. So what are our plans and methods, et cetera? So the one mechanism that the federal agencies are using is declaring that the data that's going to be involved in a piece of research is a controlled unclassified information. And we sign the terms and conditions and we hold the data. Other methods that we are using, especially we have patient data and so on and so forth. We have within the Commonwealth, actually in our iThrive, the data resides at the institution, so we have full control of it, but we provide access to the data, whoever that needs the data, so that physically we have the data stored someplace that can be looked up. At least we will know who is using it, who is looking it up. So at the institutional level, I'm looking at more at the institutional level, PI to PI collaboration, keeping in mind sensitive data on research that just does not prematurely end up in the wrong place. So we are working on those types of mechanisms is what we're working on. But I totally agree that there's a sense of data commons is necessary to work across, it's scalable, it's across PIs, across institutions, and across multiple countries. That scalable data commons is something that we have to think about and invest. And the key issue there is going to be trust. Who defines and who polices that? How do you know that my data is not going to be looked up by elsewhere? That aspect is going to be that's going to be making it slow, but yet we should consider discussing those ideas. Okay. You're muted.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry, we'll start again.
I'm sorry. Evan, we have one last time for one last question for you from our colleague Dale Copeland here at UVA. And he says there are degrees of de-integration, in other words, decoupling, right? In 1946 and onward, we completely shut down the integration set up with Russia via Lend-Lease, and then used COCOM and CHICOM to completely end all flows flows of technology into both Russia and China. But then he says, as with Japan in 1941, an economic cutoff can lead to military conflict. So shouldn't we be wary of going too far with decoupling? Okay, for some areas, but not for others.
Well, I think the reality is we may not be able to go too far because, as I said, other countries get a vote in all this. So a lot of what the United States is able to do is going to depend on what third countries do. It's one reason I don't love the COCOM analogy. It's easy to extend your export controls unilaterally. it's a lot harder to multilateralize them if you don't have the cooperation and coordination of third countries. So I think the problem with that analogy is you run into a few different factors. The first is the nature of the technology itself. Frankly, it's a hard needle to thread because, as we were talking about before, a lot of technologies now are underlying, they're multi-use, they're intrinsically dual use. So technologies that have military applications and implications also have benefits to humanity. So the same things that you can use to train a surveillance camera or that you can use for a military system, you can also use for, let's say, a self-driving car or things that save lives. So that's a needle that has to be very carefully thread because you don't want to cut your nose off to spite your face. The second problem, as I said, is third countries. If the United States wants to, as a matter of US policy, because that's what Dale's question is asking about, if the United States wants to try to attenuate China's progress or cut off co-innovation relationships with China, that's one thing. If it wants to multilateralize that, then as I said, it needs other countries to do so too. And if other countries don't do so too, because they want co-innovation partnerships with China, the ecosystem in China, the opportunity to work with Chinese researchers through collaborations, then the danger for the United States is that it actually ends up sequestering a lot of technology and a lot of the innovation that happens here behind a national wall. And so we need to ask ourselves whether, given the choices and behaviors of third countries, that's the right strategy and policy and posture for the United States. The third is that a lot of what happens in China is not easily swappable. And to give you an example, one is on the innovation side, one is on the manufacturing side. Take Taiwan and India. Taiwan's a very innovative place. But I just put out a report from the Carnegie Endowment on kind of assuring Taiwan's innovation future. It's a deep dive into the innovation ecosystem in Taiwan. And if you look at legacy areas, things like semiconductors, where Taiwan is absolutely not just world class, but best in class, and then you lay that down against future-oriented industries and you look at where Taiwan is invested or underinvested, for instance, in education, Taiwan is still churning out a huge number of electrical and mechanical engineers, very few data scientists and computer scientists. And so if you think about trajectories of how to position Taiwan for an innovation ecosystem for the future, and not just for legacy industries like semiconductors, they're actually underinvested and at a time when the engineering population is shrinking. Then you look at manufacturing, a lot of people say, oh, India could be the alternative to China. This government in India, Prime Minister Modi's government, has a Make in India policy that's designed to create more of a manufacturing system in India. But you know, the last government, the UPA-2 government in India, also had a national manufacturing policy that was supposed to take manufacturing from 16 to 25% of India's GDP. But in the event, the share of manufacturing in Indian GDP actually shrank because manufacturing ultimately is not about manufacturing policy. It's also about land acquisition policy and labor policy and a whole other set of policies that India has had trouble executing. So it's not easily swappable. And the last point I'd make is just to go back to the point Anne made about standard setting. The problem with that kind of approach to export controls is you run the risk of a world of fragmented standards where certain standards prevail in one part of the world, other standards prevail in another part of the world. That is not just a de-integrated world, it's a fragmented world that makes it hard to innovate. It also, frankly, makes it hard for American companies to operate. So all of those things matter, not just in the design of export controls, but also in the way that we think about multilateralizing them. And I think that's the challenge, is that we're kind of running off, as I said, half-cocked through this security prism, and we need to have a national debate about some of these things and their own implications for our innovation ecosystem, the future of our companies, and also what the future of a potentially fragmented global order looks like.
Thank you very much. That concludes our panel discussion on cooperation and competition in science and technology. But before we conclude our overall battle symposium on US-China relations, we have one final treat for you. Before we turn over to Bill Antholis to introduce that, I want to thank all of the panelists for their thoughts today, sharing their insights with us. And I want to thank all of those behind the scenes who have made this video colloquium so technically successful. Thanks to all of you. So back to Bill for the final event of our day.
Well, thank you, Harry and Shirley, and of course, Evan, Yen, Anne, and Ram. I'm particularly grateful for Evan being the one other man to not wear a tie during today's panels. The rest of you set a high standard. Big thanks as well to our whole tech team who have put together today's event. If you are new to the Wilt Miller Center webinars, we've been doing about 2 a week since the outbreak of the pandemic, since about mid-March, and we couldn't do it without them. I also want to thank and welcome the Charlottesville Committee on Foreign Relations. They had been planning to have Evan with them this spring when he was going to be part-time with us as the Schlesinger professor. And they were kind enough to promote today's event to their big membership and very robust membership here in Charlottesville. And I know a number of them have been out there watching, so thank you as well. We're excited to close today with a rebel in our midst, one who has made and cataloged history in a time of forbidden travel and incredibly tense US-China relations. In a period of over 20 years following the communist victory in China, the US broke away from China, barring Americans from traveling to China and largely ceding the US's ability to monitor the Chinese. One man, however, figured out a way to get around that. Bob Cohen was the first and only Westerner to be in China with a video camera during the Mao period. His videos are precious historical materials capturing the interior of China when its borders were all but closed. Bob was invited back to China in the 1970s and brought his camera again in the last decade as well to see both firsthand and capture China's dynamism over the years. Bob served in the US Army for several years, during and after which he produced several award-winning movies. As a correspondent for NBC, Bob captured the illicit footage that would eventually become Inside Red China. We're lucky to have Bob with us here today, tuning in from California, where he's been with us since 6 a.m. this morning. He's going to show us a primary artifact of China's growth over the last 6+ decades. So Bob, thanks for being with us. We're going to share our screen and show about 15 minutes of Bob's terrific filming, and then we'll have a conversation with you.
One of the basic principles of our democracy is that every citizen has the right to know what is going on, both here at home and in the world at large. Guided by this principle, when our nation's largest television network asked me to take films inside China, I decided to face whatever risks might be involved and accepted the assignment. During a 6-week trip, I traveled over 7,000 miles in this land which is larger than either the United States or Canada, and which is inhabited by almost 700 million people. The films I took there were airmailed back to New York before being developed. Not a single frame was censored or even seen by the communists. At a reception in the Xinhua Peace Hotel are leading figures in Chinese science and politics. Among them is Dr. Xian Tzu Fen, former rocket expert from the California Institute of Technology, today director of the Institute of Mechanics in Peking. The guest of honor, Chou Enlai, China's premier and foreign minister, a leading communist ever since 1927, when he organized 600,000 workers and took over Shanghai. Zhou represents China at almost every international conference. Shanghai, 4th largest city in the world, almost as large as New York, a metropolis of 8 million inhabitants. The famous Shanghai Bund, a waterfront district of formerly foreign-owned skyscrapers. Traffic along the Bund is rather sparse these days compared to pre-communist times. The thousands of foreign businessmen and servicemen who once thronged here all fled in the face of the Red Army's advance. Today, the Shanghai Bund is just another cleaned-up, workaday thoroughfare in China. This is the What did the communists do? First of all, they paved the muddy streets. Then they put electric lights in all the tenements and brought in clean water through a few hundred yards of lead piping. Finally, they set up a simple maternity clinic. These very elementary reforms had an unusually dramatic effect. The infant mortality rate fell from 35 deaths for every 100 births to only 4 deaths for every 100 children born. Canton, one of the last cities occupied by the communists, is said to have the least progressive reforms of any major city in China. It is a common sight to see women workers in the streets carrying even heavier loads than the men, as shown in this scene. When the communists arrived in Canton, there were over 100,000 people so poor that they had no land and had to live on boats and rafts. Called the sampan dwellers after the little sampan boats they used as homes, these people were the lowest class in China, almost like the untouchables of India. The communists set up a cooperative for the river people, but only half of them have joined it. 80% of the river children, however, are children of Canton sampan dwellers are learning to read and write. Changchun, site of China's first and largest truck factory, opened with Russian aid in 1956. It has 18,000 workers and is planned to produce 100,000 4.5-ton trucks per year. The store where, if you have enough money, you can buy anything you want. South of Peking to Wuhan on the Yangtze River. For the first time in Chinese history, bridges have been built over the Yangtze's raging waters. The first bridge completed was this one at Wuhan. The Wuhan Bridge is over 1 mile long. It has 2 rail lines on its lower level and 6 auto lanes on its upper section. The very foundations of the bridge rise up out of bamboo scaffolding to a height of 320 feet over the river. In the past, all trains going from the north to the south of China had to stop on the banks of the Yangtze and be floated across, car by car, on ferry boats. In times of storm or flood, the nation's rail system was cut in half. This is the Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Formerly the main entrance to the Forbidden City, it is now the Capitol building of Communist China. These Russian-designed T-34s are now being built in China. Following them come 50 to 60-ton Lenin heavy tanks. Elements of China's 3,000-plane all-jet Air Force streak past. Mao Zedong, chairman of China's Communist Party, takes his traditional walk along the top of the Tiananmen, waving his hat to the crowds below. Everything in China, the art and tradition of the past, the growing agricultural, industrial, and military might of the present, the science and plans for the future, 1/4 of the Earth's population, all organized under a strong central dictatorship. The world watches as, like the giant wave, China continues to grow stronger and stronger.
If we compare the situation as a bomb, we might say that the fuse was an inch left, the fuse connected to the bomb.
When they are printed in Shanghai, their gang consists of 3 kind of men. One group is we call 打砸抢分子，打砸抢的是 looters， 打砸抢分子，打砸抢分子啊。
Smash, smash and grabbers. That's what I was going to say. Smash and grabbers, right.
One group.
While it was evident that China had changed fundamentally, I wondered what that change would mean to the world. Would the 21st century see the new China, the largest organization of people in history, bring hope to humanity? Or would it become a threat to world peace? Beijing, the capital and political center of the People's Republic of China, is a super city, a megalopolis of close to 21 million inhabitants. Today, in 2015, its population is 5 times greater than when I first visited there in 1957.
What is beautiful to me is this whole panorama of the new bridge across the new city. These buildings here, continuing the new city. The whole new city, the Yangtze going off into the distance. Beautiful. Right.
In a shopping mall during the television coverage of the September 2015 military parade in Beijing, commemorating the defeat of the Japanese invaders at the end of the Second World War, I noticed that while several Chinese sat and watched the speeches and procession of planes, tanks, and rocket launchers, there were others who continued shopping. My overall impression was that while demanding respect as a world power, today's average Chinese prefers a quiet and peaceful life to anything else.
Well, Bob, thank you for joining us, for getting up so early and for sticking with us this whole time. And thanks to all of those out in the audience who have stuck with us. Really extraordinary to have you and to have what you've pulled together. I would just love to start the conversation by hearing about that first trip a little bit. How did it happen? What did you think you were doing? Did you realize at the time how extraordinary it was?
Well, the reality is that I knew nothing whatsoever about China prior to going there. I was a very typical US university graduate. I had my bachelor's degree, I had my master's degree. At the time I went, I was working for a doctorate at the University of Paris at the Sorbonne. I had been in the US military. I'd been stationed at Supreme Headquarters in Paris. And I liked Europe so much that I got out early from the Army in order to enroll at the Sorbonne for the doctoral program. I had no knowledge of China whatsoever. In the summer of 1957, there was a World Youth Festival in Moscow. And I discovered that it was possible to go to this festival for Americans for $120 US, which I could afford on the GI Bill. And so I, together with 4 or 5 other Americans, we decided it would be a great opportunity to see Russia before World War III came, which as an ex-GI, I was anticipating at any moment the world would evaporate in a giant atomic cloud. I mean, that was the attitude we had back in '57. And so when the opportunity came to go to China, I thought, well, it would be interesting, but I really know nothing about China. And then NBC's Moscow bureau chief, Irving R. Levine, contacted me in Moscow. I had worked for CBS while in the Army as a researcher for the Adventure Show, the American Museum of Natural History. And he said, are you going to accept an invitation to China? And I said, if I do, my name will be on the blacklist. I'll never work for a major corporation. I'll never work for the government. He said, if you do, will you film for NBC? And so obviously, even though I was not a Chinese scholar and totally ignorant about China, I said, I can't pass up this opportunity because maybe I'll be able to contribute in some small way to preventing World War III, because as a former GI, I was sure that it was going to happen. And so I accepted the assignment. I traveled in China. I didn't know what to film. I had a small camera, a little 16mm Bell and Howell. I had enough raw film for only 25 minutes of film. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation, which I, as a filmmaker, I could have shot all that film the first day, obviously. And so I pointed my camera at the tallest buildings. Obviously, Mao Zedong, I'd heard about him. Zhou Enlai, I'd heard about him. But the other leaders, I didn't even know their names. At the beginning of the film presentation, there's a shot of 5 men on the Gate of Heavenly Peace, along with Zhou Enlai. Mao had all of them killed. The other 4 men who had great Chinese leaders were all killed by Mao, and Zhou Enlai died also. When I went back in '78, it was remarkable to see how the great advances that I'd seen in '57 had suddenly disappeared. I did not know the degree to which the country had injured itself, you might say. And being able to go back again in 2015 was a great opportunity to finally put bookends on the whole thing and put it all together.
That's terrific. You know, I want to call Harry, and Harry Harding wanted to ask you a question. Harry, if you turn on your video and your audio, you can ask it, or I can ask it directly.
Let's see, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, very good.
We're not allowed to turn on the video.
Yeah, for some reason. Yeah, I think we're barred from doing that because we're no longer on the program.
I see.
But Bob, I just wanted to know, you said, and it's interesting, that the film, the footage that you sent back to the United States, to NBC, was not tampered with, it was not cut, it was probably not even viewed by the Chinese. But at the same time, I'm assuming that what you were able to film was fairly tightly controlled, monitored. Did you feel that you could film pretty much anything you wanted? You must have had people who were your guides, your handlers, we sometimes say. So talk about that part of it, how you were able to actually do the filming in China. Well,
Before getting there, I had no idea of what the situation would be. I was going strictly into terra incognito. When I got to China, I was told you can film anything you want, literally anything. On only one occasion in the several weeks that we were there was I asked not to film something. And that's when I was out in the harbor of Daren. They said, please do not film the harbor installations from the boat. Well, of course, I knew that I could understand from a bureaucratic point of view, nobody wanted to take responsibility. If I happened to do that, I had no interest in doing it anyway. But I was personally quite surprised and pleased that I could film airplanes, tanks, literally things which I had assumed would be restricted, but they were not. I could film whatever I could see. And since going there, I've learned that Zhou Enlai put out an edict saying, let these Americans see whatever they want. And literally we could. Now, obviously, getting into a prison, watching somebody being executed, this kind of stuff, which people said, why didn't you get into a prison? I was obviously under the same restrictions there that I would be if I was a journalist coming to the United States and saying, oh, I want to film all the negative things in the United States. The authorities would not rush to help me do that. And I didn't assume that I'd be able to do that. The fact that I could film in a political prison, that surprised me. Literally speaking, I was filmed free to film whatever I saw. Now, in '78, it was the same. In '78, it was even more so in that Chinese leaders like the vice mayor of Shanghai and a former minister wanted to be filmed making statements against the Gang of Four. And you'll notice that when the vice mayor of Shanghai said Gang of Four, he made this gesture, which indicates 5. I think that meant that Mao was included. Now in 2015, the situation was totally different. In 2015, it was not, I was not there as a guest of the government so much as filming with Changchun Media Group. And Changchun Media Group, being a local group, not the National Chinese Authority. The impression I got is that the people who I was working with were trying not to get into trouble with the central authorities. We could not even film a policeman in uniform. I was supposed to film the Shanghai Stock Exchange. That was canceled. All kinds of arbitrary restrictions were there, but I was not interested in them because what I was interested in showing, and what I think is the most important, is the average person walking down the street. If you film and observe the way people are dressed, the shoes they're wearing, the clothes they're wearing, the automobiles they're driving, you get a pretty good idea of the situation in a country, no matter what statistics you're quoting, what you see. And of course, I was only one, by 2015, I was only one of several million Americans who had been to China and had observed the situation there. Of course, it would be great to be able to go to a country and film anything you want, no matter how negative it might be. But I've never heard of a country where that's possible. And so I felt that in 57, certainly, in 78, certainly, I was able to film whatever I wanted to. And on 2015, I basically filmed what I thought was the most important, which is the average life situation as you see it in China. And I didn't have a special permit to do that. As a matter of fact, I did not film anything myself in 2015. All the filming was physically done by the Chinese. I said, I am not going to even bring a camera. I'm going to let them film what I asked them to film. And on only 2 or 3 occasions did they not film what I asked them to film. And I don't think that was particularly serious. On the other hand, I did not see negatives that I asked them to film. My daughter, Diana, joined me in Shanghai in the middle of the trip. My wife, Kim, was with me. We all were able to walk the streets. Nobody held our hands. We could go out in the middle of the night, whatever, and see whatever was there. And what I filmed is what you see. Now, if you go to YouTube, there are 2 Chinese-produced films called Inside Robert Carl Cohen's China. And if you can speak Chinese, there are also 3 or 4 films in English and Chinese that are up on the internet, on YouTube, to look at.
Thanks. If I could follow up, Bob, you've told us now how you made that first film in the 1950s and then sent it back to NBC, uncut, uncensored. What happened to it then? Was it broadcast? What was the reaction to it? Tell us the second part of the story.
Well, the second part of the story was, one, I had first been approached by CBS in Moscow, not NBC. I was approached by CBS because I had worked with CBS when I was in the Army. Part of my duties were at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where I was a producer, director of Army shows. And on the weekends, I would go in and work for CBS as a researcher on the Adventure Show, which was the American Museum of Natural History. And I did research for a show called Random Genetic Drift, the esoteric aspect of genetics. And so in Moscow, when I got to Moscow, at first I was working with the CBS bureau chief there, Dan Shore, and helping them film Americans and so on. And Dan Shore said to me, "Are you going to accept one of the Chinese invitations?" I said, "Dan, if I do, my name will be on the blacklist. I'll never work for a major corporation. I'll never work for the US government." He says, "If you do, will you film for CBS?" I said, "Well, that creates a dilemma because if I don't, and to be vulgar, I will kick myself in the butt for the rest of my life. And since I'm not a contortionist, I'm not adept at doing that kind of thing." The next day, Dan Shore came to me and he said, "CBS says that we will not support anyone who defies the ban on travel to China." That's the US State Department's travel ban. So I said, "Then I'm not going to go because I'm not here to defy any travel bans." He said, "However, Irving R. Levine of NBC would like to speak to you." I thought, that's interesting. Why would NBC want to speak to me and CBS didn't want to do it? So I went to see Irving R. Levine, a very nice guy. And we made a deal. He said, I'll give you a camera, I'll give you film, and we'll pay you for whatever we put on the air. And you will own whatever we don't show. That was the key. And I said, well, that might be interesting for me to own whatever they don't show. I hoped that they would show as much as possible, especially since I only had 22 minutes worth of film for all of China for 5 weeks. Well, when I got back to the States several months later and I got to New York, I was handed a cardboard box full of scraps of film. They had not even made a work print of my film. They had projected the negative, and they paid me for only the shots of the American students who were defying the travel ban. They had not aired any of my footage of Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese military. It was as if NBC did not want to show the American public the reality of life, including the military inside prisons and so on. And so I said, well, great. I took this footage and I began to show it myself on the lecture platform and found that I was in business. Universities were interested in me coming and showing them my film of China, not NBC's version. And so I became a public lecturer and was booked throughout the United States and Canada, even to the Bahamas, and found that even though I had no training as a public lecturer, that just my usual South Philly type dialogue, which as a child, I was born in South Philly, and then I lived in LA during the Zutsu Wars and so on in the 40s. My normal street manner of speaking to people was popular on the university level. And so my lecture agency started chasing me saying, get more communist countries, get more communist countries. So that I filmed in East Germany in '59. That was an even bigger hit than China. And then my agent said, get into Cuba. And I said, Sid, just because a country goes communist doesn't mean I have to go there and make a film. And he said, we got lots of demands. So I said, you get the State Department to authorize, give me permission to go to Cuba, and I'll get the Cubans. Well, the next thing I knew, I had a letter from the Department of State saying that I and my dear late wife, Elaine, were both authorized to go film in Cuba. And the only Americans actually to ever get that authorization. And so I worked it out with the Cuban Foreign Ministry. And so I was on the lecture platform for years doing Inside Red China, Inside East Germany, Inside Castro's Cuba. And I finally got so proficient at it that I was doing a show called Capital Cities of Communism, where I just told jokes, anecdotes. I told how I was arrested for kissing a girl on the cheek in Moscow one night by the morality brigade, you know, things that university students would be interested in. And I did that for up until 1965, right in the middle of the Cold War. And of course, I got a lot of stones thrown at me, you know, threatening letters and so on, the usual things to expect. But my first child, Diana, was born in '65, and I said, I don't see having children and being away from home for 2 to 3 months at a time. So it's been 55 years since I've been a public lecturer. And that's when I produced my infamous film, Mondo Hollywood, which was banned in France as a danger to mental health, and began to do other such things. But basically, that's the story. I am not an expert on China. I am more expert now than I was in '57 because I tried to find out where I had been and what it meant. But I'm very pleased to watch these experts on China discuss the country because I think it's vitally important.
Bob, let me ask you a question about that. You've seen over this extraordinary period, nearly 70 years, more than 60 years, you've seen ups and downs in the US-China relationship. I'm delighted that you told the story about how it became popular on the lecture circuit, particularly at universities, which is a sign that at every depth of the relationship, there's thirst for greater interaction, greater knowledge. And then there have been these periods of cooperation with high hopes and optimism. I'm curious to get your take at those ups and downs and what you've seen, particularly since we studied the presidency, of presidential administrations and your own reflections on how the leaders of our countries and the governments in the United States, the presidential administrations, have affected the public conversation.
I'm glad you asked me that because my family is a working class family. My father was a wallpaper hanger. My mother was a garment worker. I am a member of the Teamsters Union. At the age of 16, I was a truck driver's helper. I worked in a mercury mine as an assayer. Actually, the mine was owned by John Wayne, although he'd never been there. And so my attitude, basically, when I got to China and I saw the situation there was, these are working people. These are one out of every 4 people in the planet. This is the population of the world. And I began to study China. I said, I'd like to understand how this came to be the way it is. Over the years, I watched as, depending upon the domestic and international political situation, American attitudes toward China would go up and down, usually on a 2 to 3 year basis. But many people would take advantage of problems for their own political purpose. Under Eisenhower and Nixon, China was a bad place, okay? Under Kennedy Johnson, well, just in my own personal instance, when my passport expired and I tried to renew it, the State Department refused to renew it. Then in 1959, this was still Eisenhower, Nixon, they said if I promise not to go back to China, they'll give me a passport. So I signed a document, I paid a notary public 50 cents, and I said, I accept the passport with the limitations therein. Suddenly I got a passport back in 59. In 61, I got a letter of commendation from the Kennedy State Department, from the Undersecretary of State, Chester Bowles' office. But then in the late 60s, I was put on the National Security Index, people to be put in prison in case of a national emergency under the Nixon administration. Depending on who's in Washington, I'm either a great American or a dangerous subversive. I'm still the same guy that I was from day one. And as someone who has attended 3 different universities, I'm a UCLA, USC, and the University of Paris, I can only tell you that university students, in my experience, are people who want to know what's going on. Now, maybe when they get out of college and they get locked into a job where your opinion can get you fired or can get you a promotion, depending on who owns the company, it may change. But students are curious people, and young people are curious. And I am now in my 90th year, which makes me, I think, one of the senior people on your program. We old folks, it is our obligation to help young people understand the world. And to me, politically speaking, it's very simple. The United States is still the most powerful advanced country in the world. China is 1/4 of the world's population. We sit on opposite sides of the planet, and yet, to use the old yin-yang thing, we must unite, the United States and China. I'm not saying to be one country, but our minds have to be united in that we are united in trying to benefit the human race. US-Chinese relationship, friendship is essential for life on this planet. And I'm happy if I'm able to contribute in some small way.
Bob, that's really terrific. I think you've answered Melissa Ruckmick's question, which is how can we integrate your knowledge to move forward in the best possible way by seeing each other as complementary. Let me ask a question from Timothy Rockwood. Having visited China with a camera from Eisenhower's time until recently, do you believe our respective scientists and governments will cooperate on this new pandemic and the ones to come, or will military domination subsume humanitarian collaboration? When you look back at the last 60 some odd years since your first visit, where is your instinct about what will happen next?
Well, I am not a professional. I was not a professional soldier. I was a draftee. They happened to station me as a TV director and then at Supreme Headquarters in Paris, among other things. But I do have friends in the military today. And my friends in the military are all for working out a relationship. The public, as far as people that I know, my friends in the military, we all want to have a good relationship with everyone. We don't want to have antagonism. The public today, I don't think, has a full awareness of how perilous life on this planet is. All it would take would be two people on a US Navy ship that has nukes pushing the buttons at the same time to launch. And once the first nuke is launched, everybody is going to launch. Once a nuclear explosion takes place, it creates an electromagnetic pulse, which effectively blacks out all radio and radar. Therefore, once the first bomb goes off, all the bombs are going to be launched. We can't have that. We live on the edge of the abyss of world annihilation. All talk of conflict has to be suppressed. We have to work together for the future. I have children, I have grandchildren. I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren and everybody's grandchildren to grow up in a peaceful world. And I urge everyone capable, whatever your differences, whatever your political opinion is concerned, the main thing is peace. We must have peace.
Let me ask a final question. As we're approaching 12:55, we had intended to wrap up at 12:45, but we got a little late start. So I'm going to close with this question. Can you speak to the power of film? You've made so many different films over the years and involved in different, but they all really started with this enterprise. How can the lens of the camera help capture not just societies, but societies undergoing transformations as you've seen in China? And what is the role of film engendering the kind of cooperation and understanding that you just spoke of?
That's an interesting question, because film can be used for good and bad. The same shot, depending upon what you say, can either make someone say that's good or that's bad. I have always considered myself a front page journalist rather than an editorial writer. I have tried my best to fulfill the 5 W's, okay? Who, what, where, when, why. When I point the camera at something, I want to supply information as what is this, what am I showing, and why am I showing it? Film can be used to help people throughout the world understand one another. It can also be used to make people frightened and attack one another. I urge our networks, I urge our news sources to use images, because film is just moving images. To try, I personally would like to have an ongoing show in the United States about life in China on a daily basis, and to have an ongoing show in China about life in the United States. Certainly the major countries, we as Americans, we have the technical facility today, as do people throughout the world really, to see things happening everywhere. And I think the more we see, the less we can be affected by opinion. Opinion is good if it's informed opinion. Uninformed opinion can be driven by insanity. Today, we are faced with a situation in which antagonism is being promoted for financial and political gain. This is extremely dangerous. We should be promoting understanding. Understanding doesn't mean approving everything somebody else does, but at least to understand what the situation is and what our relationship is, free of polemic, free of attacks. Just the facts. What are the facts? The facts are that the people of the United States and the people of China have a mutual interest, and that mutual interest is world peace. Every American, every Chinese, and every person on this planet needs to work together for mutual benefit and for world peace. And that is my message.
Well, Bob, thank you for that very uplifting and optimistic note at the end. I think the one thing that we've learned through the power of Zoom is that we have an ability to communicate across space and even time to some degree that is an enormous leap forward from 1957. But we're really appreciative for you of getting it started way back then. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for this series of terrific conversations this morning. The biggest thanks go out to Shirley and Harry for being the intellectual leaders of this enterprise, for conceiving and framing this important and timely event. Big thanks to Matt Pottinger and Jim Steinberg, and of course to our own Evan Feigenbaum and Ann Kokas, as well as to Ram and Yen Pottinger for joining us on that panel. Of course, to Stephanie Georgiakis Abbott and our whole communications team for making this look easy and for getting the word out on this event. Big thanks to Barry Battle for sponsoring the Battle Symposium, and to the Charlottesville Committee on Foreign Relations for your partnership and friendship over these many years. And then finally, thanks to the hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 of you who joined us today, if you combine the Zoom event with a big YouTube audience out there, for making the 2020 Battle Symposium so special. And we look forward to seeing you again next year.